Marek, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 4, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 10. Marek lifted the cool glass of juice to his lips and took a sip as his gaze scanned the screen of the laptop opened in front of him. He swept his right index finger over the touchpad, scrolling through the document. It had taken him months to transcribe every handwritten report he had stored in the basement of his villa, centuries of documents filled by his brothers, detailing every demon they had come across and any unusual gate activity they had noticed. It had been worth it. Now he had all that information at his fingertips, although it did take some searching and he couldn't begin to calculate how many hours he had spent in his office or on this recliner, under one of the larger trees that were spotted around the main garden of his home in the hills. There were 2 servers dedicated to patrol reports alone, another where he stored information on every demon they had ever encountered, and he had started a 4th recently. That one held all the information they were gathering on their enemy. Marek closed the file as he reached the end of it and opened another, scanning it for any mention of a time the gates had called his brothers, and it had turned out there hadn't been a hellspawn or higher present. So far, he had only uncovered one incident over a century ago. The Hong Kong gate had called Diamond to open it, but when he had gotten there, only demons had been present. Marek switched to that document and read it again. Diamond had disposed of the demons, but had noted that 2 had been shapeshifters and there had been 1 from the demonic breed. He pulled up the more recent report from Valen, one his brother had belatedly filed yesterday, recounting all the details he could remember about what had happened at the gate in Rome. There had been a shapeshifter and a demonic male then as well, together with demons Valen had labeled as bloodsuckers, not vampires because his brother would be able to recognize their scent. If they had been rogue vampires, it would have easily explained things. As a recognized breed of hellspawn, vampires were allowed to pass through the gates, if Hades granted it. Was it possible one of them had been a mixed breed, part vampire and part something else, with enough hellspawn blood to be allowed entrance to the underworld? Marek almost laughed as he immediately discounted that. His father wouldn't allow a mixed breed into the underworld, purebred vampires only. Even turned vampires had to age at least a century and prove their lineage and loyalty before Hades considered allowing them access to his realm. He closed the 2 reports and kept scanning, humming as he sifted through another 10 documents, taking the odd break to rest his eyes and sip his drink. The day was wearing on, the second that had passed since he had last seen Katerina. His focus wavered as she filled his mind, as the taste of her and the way she had felt in his arms tugged at him, flooding him with a need to see her again. He should have asked for her number, shouldn't have let her leave with only a promise that he would see her again. She had been distant when she had parted from him, asking him to meet her again in 3 nights. When he had pressed her to tell him why he couldn't meet her the next night, she had clammed up and said that she had something she had to do. What did she need to do that took 3 nights? Marek had pondered that question far too much during their time apart. It kept intruding, demanding an answer and distracting him from his work, which set him on edge. If his brothers saw him like this, unable to focus on his research, they would immediately know something was wrong. The last thing he needed was his brothers probing into his life, and not only because it might lead them to discovering his penchant for killing vampires. He growled and clenched his teeth as he thought about Katerina, about his brothers wanting to know about her, demanding to meet her. Katerina was his, and he would keep her that way. He wouldn't let his brothers near her. If they didn't drive her away with their overbearing protectiveness, they might make a play for her. She was beautiful. God, she was beautiful. One of them was bound to want her as their own. They couldn't have her. His mood took a dark turn, and he glared at the screen of his laptop as his fangs emerged. The black need to protect Katerina and keep her at his side, his alone, flooding him with a terrible urge to fight. Not vampires, not demons. He wanted to fight his brothers. The heat of summer suddenly gave way to icy cold that lasted only a heartbeat. That heartbeat of time was enough for him to react, to fix his gaze on the one who had created it and snarl at her. Enyo arched a fine black eyebrow at him. "Someone is in a mood." "Someone doesn't need this shit," he snapped and set his laptop aside as he sat up on the wooden recliner. "Go bother someone else." Her jade green eyes brightened, the black that ringed them seeming to grow thicker as she glared at him. Normally, he took the hint and backed down, not wanting to provoke her into killing him by being rude to her. But this time, he was more worried about Karis killing him because she had visited him. "Leave, Enyo." He shoved to his bare feet, slipped them into his sandals, and stormed towards the whitewashed villa. She stepped into his path and stared him down as he halted, her 6-foot frame bringing her level in height to him as she stood on the edge of the terracotta patio near the door, slightly up the slope from him. The light breeze stirred the tips of her sleek black hair as she held his gaze, brushing it away from the right side of her face. "I have information. I thought you were the one who dealt with such things." Trying to sweeten him up. He wasn't the only one who liked to get their hands dirty with research, happy to spend hours glued to a chair, poring over every tiny detail in the hunt for the one clue that would give them a lead they could work on. All this to eliminate their enemy and fulfill their duty. Karis enjoyed it as much as he did. Marek debated mentioning that to provoke a reaction from the goddess of war, and then thought the better of it. He looked her over from the thick black cloak that hung from her shoulders to the silver and black chest piece, and the short black strips of leather that passed as a skirt, to her knee-high black leather boots and the silver filigree that decorated them. She had come armed for war again, right down to the black and silver vambraces that protected her forearms. The only thing that was missing was her sword. But then the war she was armed for wasn't a physical one. It was an emotional battle, and she wrapped herself in the trappings of her duty in order to avoid waging it, in order to protect herself. Her green gaze flicked beyond him to the recliners positioned beneath the tree. "You should stop sleeping in the sunshine, Marek." He frowned at her. If she wasn't going to play nice, then he wouldn't either. "Go and talk to another brother. Try Karis. He is our leader. All information you have, you can pass it to him." The air chilled and the sky darkened, clouds forming above the villa to blot out the blue. He was pushing his luck. "Perhaps I should pass on information about what I witnessed in my last visit to you," she snapped. He growled at her as an image of her sitting atop a stack of crates, surveying the aftermath of a battle he had waged against vampires, flashed across his eyes, and his blood ran cold. "You would not dare." At least he hoped she wouldn't. He had never figured her for a fan of blackmail, but clearly she was determined to get her way and avoid Karis, and she didn't care if she had to trample Marek emotionally in order to get it. "You tell any of my brothers what you saw, and you will regret it." Marek squared up to her. He wouldn't win in a fight against her, mostly because he would pull his punches so Karis didn't kill him, but he wasn't going to sit back and let her threaten him. "What about if I tell your father?" He stepped back, bracing himself as that verbal blow hit him, and clenched his fists as the momentary shock passed and regret flared in her eyes. "I would not," she said before he could find his voice. She looked away from him, down the sloping garden towards the valley basin, and wrapped her right hand around her left biceps. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Let me relay the information to you, Marek." Seeing such a powerful goddess, one who had been all smiles and laughter once, looking on the verge of tears, had him relenting and easing back another step. He sighed and turned away from her, sat his arse back down on the recliner, and waited. "Fine, but if I get killed, it's your fault. I want you to know that." He reached around and grabbed his laptop, balanced it on his knees, and opened a new document. He was going to capture this information verbatim and file it to his brothers via email. It seemed safer than meeting Karis in person to hand it over to him. He might be able to avoid the worst of the fallout. "Ares, my brother, sent me this time." Her hand fell from her arm and she slowly recovered, straightening as the seconds passed, her eyes gaining that confident edge that had always been there whenever they had met in the underworld, before Karis had been sent away to the mortal realm with the rest of them. She twisted the braided length of hair that hung from her left temple, twining it around her fingers as she frowned. "The feeling returned. It is stronger this time, and there are rumors that others on Olympus are experiencing it too." Marek didn't bother to write that down. Enyo had already warned him that her brother could sense something coming, something powerful. "The twin gate activated." As those words left his lips, her green eyes widened. He looked down at his knees. "I know. It came as a shock to us, too. When I went there, only demons were waiting. Our enemy. We suspect that a hellspawn or possibly even someone like a demigod might be involved. Ridiculous, right? He kept hoping it was nothing more than a wild theory, but everything was pointing towards it being a very real possibility. And that had him worried. What if this was more than a few demons taking a shot at claiming the crown? Demons they could handle. Hellspawn and demigods would prove more of a challenge, and they couldn't be sure some of them weren't already in the underworld working right under his father's nose to maneuver the pieces into place to cause his downfall. Enyo was silent for a long time, so long he had to listen to the song of the insects and the birds to calm his nerves. He wanted her to say his theory was foolish, impossible. He willed her to say it. "Whoever Ares can feel, they are growing stronger each day," she said, and he closed his eyes. That wasn't good. "It seems unlikely, though. Who would dare implement such a plan against Hades?" He shrugged. "Father does have his enemies. The two previous rebellions proved that. I have a theory that this relates to one of those times, but that would mean whoever is behind it was alive then." "And that would mean they are not a demon." She crouched at the edge of the patio. Marek averted his gaze, bringing his hand up to block his view for good measure, just in case Karis decided to take a peek at his memories later. "Exposing way more than I want to see, Enyo." "I am wearing undergarments." "I know that, but I do not want to see them. I like breathing." "I would not kill you." He huffed and muttered, "You might not. Someone else will." "Is this more acceptable?" He wasn't sure it was wise to risk looking at her, part of him expecting her to be in a worse position now, one that was sure to sear itself onto his mind and therefore get him killed. He cracked one eye open and gingerly peeked over his hand. She was sitting on the edge of the patio, her knees firmly shut and absolutely nothing on show. He nodded. "If you are going to insist on coming to see me, please wear more clothing." "Do you find my armor exciting?" She glanced down at herself, a crinkle forming between her eyebrows. "No, I find it terrifying." It was strange being so candid with her. "It's like facing a death sentence, and you never know quite when it's going to happen, but you feel sure it will at some point." He blamed Katerina. Amazing sex clearly loosened his tongue. Either that or it had fried his brain. He did still feel a little frazzled. He shook himself back to Enyo before his thoughts could traverse paths that would only make him look as if he did find her armor arousing. "Can you do a little digging for me?" Changing the subject seemed like a sensible course of action, one that might keep him alive. "Any information you can get would be greatly appreciated. Just listen in on conversations or try to get more out of your brother. We need an inside man or woman on this one." She nodded. "Of course. With all the tension on Earth right now, I can come and go quite easily. Would you like me to do some digging in the underworld, too?" He thought about that. "If you can manage it without alerting my father to our suspicions. You know Hades. The last thing we need is him finding out there might be more than demons involved." She smiled. "He would probably evict everyone from the underworld." "And our enemy would go to ground. We need them to think they're on course to achieve their goal. If they go to ground, it could be centuries before they resurface." And Marek had been in the mortal world for centuries already. He wanted to go home. Katerina spun into his mind in a blur of silver, her sword swinging as she fought invisible foes in the dark, mesmerizing him. Maybe he didn't want to go home. Not yet. He could stand to live here a little longer. But he wanted it to be his choice. There was a vast difference between being stuck in the mortal realm, banished from his home, and choosing to live here while being able to visit the underworld and his parents, free to come and go between the two worlds. He wasn't sure he could live with another 2 centuries of this, not only because he missed home. If Katerina became something to him, the only way to make her live as long as he needed her to would be to take her to the underworld, which would mean parting from her while he was trapped on Earth, protecting the gates. That would probably drive him mad. Ares and Megan would face the same fate too, separated by duty, and so would Valen and Eva. Valen had only just started becoming more bearable, some of his rougher edges smoothed off by his woman. Marek could live without him becoming caustic and quick to fight with everyone again.
This troubles you greatly,
Ennio said, and he cursed himself for getting lost in thought, forgetting she was there. He nodded. It troubles us all.
I will do my best to find out who is behind this, Marek. You have my word on that.
She stood slowly, and he was thankful she was careful to keep her underwear hidden, smoothing her skirt down as she rose to her feet. Thank you. He waited for her to teleport. She lingered, rolled her lower lip inwards as if she wanted to bite it but had thought the better of it. Her gaze drifted away from him, roaming towards the distant hazy hills across the ochre olive tree-spotted valley.
How is your brother?
Those words, softly spoken, laced with a wobble of uncertainty, told Marek how difficult that question was for her to ask. He smiled, hoping to calm her nerves as she glanced at him. Which one? She scowled.
You know which one.
Why don't you ask him yourself? He meant that playfully, but grimaced as she looked away from him, her brow furrowing. She turned on her heel. Panic lanced him, and he shot to his feet. Wait. She looked over her shoulder at him, green eyes filled with emotions. Hope, despair, pain, love. It was all there, mingled with other feelings, ones that seemed to increase the strength of some and weaken the rest. Marek was going to get into trouble for this, but she needed to know. Karis hasn't been the same since leaving home. You should go and see him. I'm sure he would like to see you, Ennio. A swift shake of her head was exactly the response he had expected. Her words, however, were the opposite.
He would not want to see me.
He found that hard to believe. You want to bet on that? My brother won't admit it, but he's lonely. And he constantly played with the ring Ennio had given him.
Lonely?
Her eyebrows rose high on her forehead.
Karis could have any mortal he chose.
Her voice wobbled on his brother's name, betraying how deeply saying it had affected her, together with the way the pain in her eyes grew stronger. Although maybe that had something to do with the fact she clearly and wrongly believed his brother had been unfaithful to his feelings for her. He hasn't touched a single one, Ennio. Maybe he doesn't want any mortal. If you would just go and... Her eyes narrowed and the world swiftly darkened, night seeming to close in as black clouds boiled overhead.
You presume too much. Do not think to meddle in affairs that do not concern you, boy.
She was gone in a flash of white-blue smoke that lingered in the air where she had been. He presumed too much? He laughed. Did she think he was the only one who had noticed that she loved Karis? The only one who was blind to it was Karis himself. Neither of them had a clue about the other's feelings. Or maybe they did, and they had stupidly been waiting for hundreds of years for the other one to make the first move. Marek looked at his laptop, pursed his lips, and shrugged. Maybe Karis and Ennio just needed a damn push. He pulled his phone from the pocket of his black linen trousers, fired off a message, and then stepped, landing on the porch of the Tokyo mansion. The warm light from the huge stone lantern spaced along the path at his back illuminated the white walls and darkened the ancient wood to black. He looked over his shoulder at the garden and the wall that surrounded it, breathed in the cool night air, and steeled himself for what was to come. This was foolish, insane, reckless. But someone needed to make Ennio and Karis face their feelings, and he felt sure that Karis wouldn't kill him if all their brothers were present. At least, he hoped he wouldn't. Maybe this was a bad idea. He considered stepping back to Seville and then stopped himself, the curious part of him demanding he stay and see it through. He had provoked a reaction from Ennio tonight. He wanted to provoke one from his brother, too. He wanted confirmation of Karis's feelings to see whether they really did match the ones Ennio had revealed. He towed his sandals off and set them on the rack, taking his time about it as a series of high giggles rose from the other side of the door, together with a few husky murmured words. A phone jingled. The giggling ceased. A snarl cut through the late-night air. Fucking Marek. Charming. Although Marek would have been angry, too, if someone had disturbed his alone time with Katerina. Katerina. Gods, he wanted to see her again. The urge to track her down was strong, rousing a fierce need to obey it. He wanted to kiss her again, wanted to hear his name on her lips as she found release. But more than that, he wanted to fight at her side, with her at his back, chasing the ultimate high, the one that came from slaying vermin. Someone slapped him on the back, jerking him forwards. Callistos laughed. Not like you to space out. Marek shrugged it off. I'm just tired. Research is taking longer than expected. Aries eased around both of them to place his leather boots down on the rack to the right of the porch. You're causing a queue. Any reason you're standing out here? They were, Marek tried to think of a delicate way to put it. Doing the nasty, Valen chimed in, a grin in his voice. Makes me shudder. Thought of my big bros going at it like rabbits. You're one to talk. Aries tossed Valen daggers, his eyes faintly glowing as his mood shifted. I'm not the one who has angry sex. Callistos covered his ears. This is so disgusting. I don't want to know about any of this. Virgin? Valen shoved Cal in the shoulder, sending him into Marek, and then went flying across the garden, narrowly avoiding clipping one of the lanterns. He jerked to a halt an inch from the wall, his head whipping backwards and the longer lengths of his violet hair flying upwards before falling down over both his eyes. They narrowed on Callistos and burned gold. Keep pushing me, brother. See what happens. Callistos flipped him off. Keep calling me a virgin and see what happens. I've had my share of women, and I'm getting sick of you all treating me like a kid. Valen dropped to the gravel as Callistos released his hold on him and casually dusted his black combats and t-shirt off, even though no dirt had gotten on them. Don't tell me. You met all these girls at camp and they live in another state? Marek wasn't sure what that meant, but it firmly pressed Callistos' buttons. He flew at Valen. Karis appeared in his path, pressed his palm to Callistos' chest, and stopped him dead. Temper. Karis looked over his shoulder at Valen, his green eyes looking black in the low light from the lanterns. If I have to tell you one more time not to provoke him, we will fall out, Valen. Valen waited until Karis had his back to him again before he pulled a face at him, mocking their older brother. Karis looked from Callistos to Marek, and Marek braced himself. It wasn't the light from the lamps that made Karis's eyes look black as they narrowed on Marek. The storm raging in his brother's eyes passed quickly, though, disappeared in a blink that left them green again. That was disappointing. Karis strode to the porch where Marek stood, and he waited, sure his brother would say or do something. You have information to report, I presume. Let us not waste time. Karis removed his black-polished shoes, placed them neatly on the rack, and moved past him, entering the mansion ahead of everyone. That bad feeling Marek had felt in the shower days ago returned, unsettling him. He looked at Aries as the others filed past him, meeting his gaze and catching the concern in it. He wasn't the only one who had expected more of a reaction from Karis, and he wasn't the only one unsettled by how easily Karis had let it go. Aries jerked his chin towards the open door behind him. Give him another go. Why? It sounded like suicide to Marek, although maybe not. He wasn't sure what to feel as he thought about it. Barely an hour ago, he would have stepped back to Seville rather than making another attempt to get a reaction from Karis, afraid of his older brother losing his temper. Now part of him needed to push him. He needed to get a reaction from him. Something is wrong. Aries looked beyond him. I don't know what it is, but I know it's wrong. Marek risked a glance over his shoulder, into the long room where his brothers all waited on the crisp golden tatami mats, deep in discussion already. His gaze tracked Aiko as she hurried from the kitchen to the left with a tray of drinks for everyone, Escher hot on her heels. The demon that had managed to escape them, the one they called the illusionist, had imitated Escher in order to get to Aiko. He shifted his focus to Karis. It can't be the illusionist. The wards are new, unknown to them. Marek looked back at Aries. His brother shook his head, his deep brown eyes solemn as he ran a hand through his tawny hair. I don't think it's that. I don't know what it is, but something is up. Are we having this meeting or not? Valen barked as he leaned forwards to peer through the door at Marek. Sure. Aries came up beside Marek, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Just don't push too hard. Marek nodded, unsure this was a wise idea, but on board with it. Karis hadn't reacted to the scent of Enyo on him, not really. With their blood, a passing flash of darkness was nothing in their world. It certainly wasn't on par with the reaction Marek had gotten the last time he had come to a meeting fresh from a visit by Enyo. He followed Aries into the house, nerves rising as he joined the circle of his brothers in the center of the main living area. Karras stood opposite, his green eyes clear and calm, no trace of emotion in them. "What new intel do you have?" "I checked the files, some of them. So far, I've turned up nothing." He hesitated, and Ares gave him a look that told him to get on with it as he came to a halt beside Karras. Marek focused on Karras, watching closely, seeking a reaction in case it was as subtle as before and he missed it. "Enyo reported that her brother is no longer the only one who can feel something coming, and that whatever he is feeling, it is getting stronger every day." Karras's eyes remained eerily flat and empty. "Very well. Anything else?" What the hell? He was tempted to take a step towards his brother and ask what was wrong with him, but kept his bare feet planted to the mats. Beside Karras, Ares looked worried, his gaze on his brother's profile and his brow furrowed. Marek tried again. "I told Enyo our theory and asked her to help us, and she agreed. She will keep an eye and ear open on Olympus, and even offered to scout the underworld." Karras still wasn't affected. Ares was right. Something was wrong. It was almost as if whatever feelings Enyo visiting normally evoked in Karras had been numbed or crushed out of existence, which couldn't be right. He knew that Karras felt something powerful for the goddess. The fallout from the last time she had visited was proof of that. So what had happened between then and now? He studied his brother in silence as they all discussed theories and how Enyo might be able to help them, not missing how Karras's eyes remained devoid of feeling the entire time, or how his voice was too calm, distant almost. Karras slipped his hands into the pockets of his black trousers, and that strange calmness seemed to grow. Ares wasn't the only one who looked concerned now. Valen stared at Karras, and then at Ares, and finally at Marek, the look in his golden eyes telling Marek that he had noticed Karras had changed too. Marek subtly looked at everyone and caught the same worry in their eyes. Had he pushed Karras too far, causing him to withdraw into his thoughts? Or was there another reason he felt as if he was looking at a shadow of his brother? Chapter 11. Katerina jostled the bags of groceries, swapping hands to stop her fingers from going numb. Guillaume had promised to try to eat something, so she had gone to the store via the butcher and purchased him a container of pig's blood. It was the best she could do, although she doubted that it would help him. The last time he had tried to drink pig's blood, he had ended up vomiting it all over the table. It had been cold that time, perhaps if she warmed it. The thought of warming blood in her microwave turned her stomach, and she shoved it out of her mind as she shouldered the door to her apartment building open and worked her way up the stairs. She looked down at the bag that contained the blood when she reached her apartment door. It had to work, even if it only staved off the worst of the effects, buying Guillaume more time. Time she badly needed now that Marek had filled her head with doubts. She had done her best to cling to hope, but it had been fading over the last 2 days, withering away just like her brother was. She had tried to talk to Guillaume about it, but every time she had found her voice or the right way to word things, she had ended up saying something else. Anything else to avoid disappointing him. She needed to talk to him, though. Couldn't let it go on any longer. Because she didn't only want to talk to him about what she had learned. She also wanted to talk to him about Marek. She needed her brother's advice about what she had done. Had it been wrong of her? It hadn't felt wrong. It didn't feel wrong. But Marek wasn't human like her.
Guillaume.
She pushed the door open and frowned when he wasn't in the living room. He had been there when she had left an hour ago, watching one of his favorite TV programs on Netflix. Maybe he was in the shower. He had talked about wanting one before she had left.
Guillaume?
She called again and listened. She couldn't hear any water running. She turned towards the kitchen, thoughts drifting to Marek and what she had done. It had been good at the time, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt as if she was getting in too deep into a world she knew little about. Falling down that dreaded rabbit hole. That feeling only intensified as she pushed the kitchen door open and found Guillaume standing on the other side of the table they had squeezed into the limited space. And he wasn't alone. A beautiful woman stood behind him, almost as tall as he was, her long fall of dark violet hair shimmering black beneath the harsh lights. Her quicksilver eyes lifted to meet Katerina's gaze. The woman smiled, her black-painted lips curling softly, and her irises shifted, the silver in them swirling. Her slender, pale hand gently gripped Guillaume's throat, her black nails a stark contrast against his ashen skin. He kept his chin tilted up as his dull hazel eyes fixed on Katerina.
Guillaume,
She whispered and slowly lowered her bags to the tiles, afraid that if she moved too fast that the woman would spook and hurt him.
please, let him go.
She will not hurt him. The deep male voice held a note of authority, a command that drew her focus to its owner. He sat at her small square kitchen table, casually reclining in one of the wooden chairs, his feet resting on the oak surface and the scuffed soles of his black knee-high riding boots facing her. His hands rested in his lap, as pale as the moon against tight onyx trousers, and the long coat he wore spilled from his hips to pool on the floor. She followed the trail of silver buttons up his chest to the tight collar, and forced her gaze to keep moving as nerves began to rise, awakening the need to run, because she was more than getting in too deep. She was already down the rabbit hole, and at the bottom a monster had been waiting. His violet eyes held hers, rendering her immobile, stealing all her focus. "I need you to do me a favor." His regal accent sent a shiver tumbling down her spine, his calm tone setting her on edge for some reason. She flicked a glance at the woman holding her brother. Not a vampire. She was something else. Her eyes leaped back to the violet-eyed, black-haired man. He was something else, too. Something dangerous. Every instinct she had honed over the last decade screamed that at her. They were both dangerous, and they had her brother at their mercy.
Guillaume, are you all right?
She glanced at her brother again, and he gave a strained nod, only able to move his head a few millimeters as the woman tightened her grip on his throat. Katerina's gaze shot down to the man seated at her kitchen table.
You hurt him, and I'll...
She trailed off when his eyes narrowed slightly, in a way that screamed he wanted her to finish that sentence with the impotent threat that had been on the tip of her tongue.
And I won't do anything for you.
She hated how weak and defeated she sounded as she uttered those words, rather than the threat of violence she had wanted to throw at him. She wanted to say that she wasn't interested in doing them a favor, but she knew in her heart they weren't giving her a choice. If she didn't do what they wanted, they would hurt Guillaume. Or worse. And then they would probably kill her. Her eyes lifted back to Guillaume, her heart aching with a need to set him free, to get him away from the woman and this man. Guillaume's eyes remained dull, his gaze distant, as if he wasn't quite here in the room with them. A bad day. Her brother always looked like that when the hunger became too much for him, always withdrew and ended up passing days without uttering a word. It broke her heart. He had looked so well the other night that she had fooled herself into thinking he was getting better. "We just need you to do something." The man's calm tone, each word spoken carefully, set her on edge. Katerina locked gazes with him again. She hadn't meant to, had only intended to glance at him, but something about those eyes made it impossible to look away from them. They brightened, holding her, and she struggled to keep her focus as she fell into them. Her brother was in danger. That sharpened her senses again, allowing her to claw back some control of herself.
What will I get in return?
She said. The man smiled, a spark of amusement igniting in his eyes. To live? Katerina tensed. His smile widened, grew charming as he theatrically waved his hand towards Guillaume where he stood behind him, still held by the beautiful woman. You clearly love your brother. Do you need any other motivation? We have been watching you since we first saw you with him. She frowned.
With my brother?
No. His smile turned cold. The wretched god.
God? Do not play dumb. You know who we are speaking about.
The woman snapped, each word lashing at Katerina, driving them deep into her mind. Until a thought crystallized. She did know who they were talking about. She just hadn't expected Marek to be a god. Your brother is sick, the man continued, his shrewd gaze leaving Katerina in no doubt that he knew more about her than he was letting on, and that he knew she was aware the man she had slept with was no man at all. Do this for us, and we can make him better. Her heart leaped at that before she could stop it, and she feared he had seen it as his eyes narrowed slightly, the corners of his lips curling in response. She told herself not to believe him, not to let him blind her with hope just as she had lost it. There would be a catch. There always was in this sort of situation. She had been losing hope, and this man had appeared to offer her everything she had been fighting for this last decade. No way there wasn't a catch, and it wouldn't be a huge one. Life just wasn't that kind to her.
I see doubts in those eyes of yours.
He leaned back further and dropped his feet to the floor, sitting up and commanding all of her focus again.
I assure you, I can make Guillaume better. You just need to do this one thing for me, and then you can have what you want. Your brother well again. You do want that, do you not, Katerina?
The silky persuasiveness of his voice made it hard to remember that he was holding her brother hostage, and that he wasn't here out of the kindness of whatever black heart lurked beneath his tight coat. It lulled her and had her falling into his eyes all over again. She snapped herself out of it and looked at Guillaume, seeking her strength there in his eyes, in the way he was still looking at her, trusting her to save him.
More than anything,
she whispered, aching to go to him as he shook, his eyes glazing as hunger got the better of him. Hunger she had hoped to assuage with damned pig's blood when she knew that wasn't what he needed. What he needed was help, and that was the one thing she couldn't give him. Hunting vampires wasn't going to save him. She could see that now. All she had been doing was fooling herself, burying her head in the sand because she didn't want to face facts. She was going to lose the only family she had left.
How do I know you can help him, though?
She looked back at the man, the desperation building inside her, lacing her voice for him to hear. She was too tired to hold it back and hide it, too low in spirits to pretend she still had hope. Marek had burst that dam, and it was flooding out of her now.
I know his breed better than anyone.
He parted his lips and revealed short canines that slowly extended, becoming white daggers.
I can save him, Katerina. You only need to do as I ask.
You're a vampire. He shook his head.
No, I am not one of that breed, Katerina. I know it well enough, though.
Well enough to save Guillaume?
There's no cure,
she whispered, testing the waters, determined to discover once and for all whether it was possible for Guillaume to be freed of his curse. Marek had told her it might be possible. What would this man say? She studied him as she steadied her nerves.
He told me that much.
His face darkened.
The wretched God does not know of your brother's situation. If he did, Guillaume would be dead. He does not know how you suffer, desperate to save him. I know, Katerina. I know, and I can help him. I can free him of this curse. I've done it for others.
The shattered fragments of her hope slowly pieced themselves back together in her heart as she listened to him, as she saw the conviction in his violet eyes, the belief that he could help Guillaume. She looked at her brother again. She knew what the man wanted her to do. He wanted her to pick between her brother and Marek. She was attracted to Marek and had thought things between them could have grown into something given time, something more than explosive passion. But if she had to choose between him and her brother, she would pick her brother every time. She forced herself to nod, schooled her features, and refused to let the man or the woman see how much this hurt her. Her stomach squirmed, and she resisted the urge to touch it, to rub it and get it to settle, as she waited for the man to speak. She silently apologized to Marek. She had no choice. This was Guillaume they were talking about, her brother.
Lure the god under your spell and into a trap for me.
The man eased onto his feet, coming to tower over her brother and the woman.
We have tried this before, but the fool failed. With this brother, we will do it right. Find the wretch, cast your spell, and cast it well. I will tell you the next step once I am satisfied the hook is set.
Katerina didn't like the sound of being bait for Marek, not the way the man painted it, wanting her to continue growing closer to him. She wasn't an actress. When she felt something, it showed 90% of the time. Her mother had always said she wore her heart on her sleeve when it came to her deeper feelings. Even when she was facing vampires, she found it hard to conceal her true feelings in order to deceive them and allow her to get the jump on them. Could she pretend everything was fine between her and Marek? Could she even be around him without risking falling for him? If the man spoke true, then they had attempted this ploy with one of his brothers. Surely that meant Marek would be on alert, wary of women or people attempting to seduce him in case it was a trap. Although he hadn't been at all wary of her on that rooftop in the dark. She didn't want to think about that moment, not only because it stirred heat in her, had the attraction she felt towards Marek rising to the fore again to fill her head with a need to see him, but because she feared the man before her had witnessed it all. That was the reason he was here now. He had seen what she had done with Marek and felt sure she could carry out this task for him. Could she? Whenever she thought about luring Marek into a trap, the churning in her stomach worsened and war erupted inside her, a battle between what she felt for Marek and her love for her brother. Guillaume suddenly bowed forwards and struggled against the woman's hold. She was quick to subdue him again, wrestling him back under control as Katerina's gaze leaped to him. His eyes were bright and wild as he stared at her, his chest heaving with each hard breath he sucked down. "Why are you hesitating?" he spat in Catalan, the venom in his voice shocking her. "I'm your brother. He's nothing to you. Nothing. You love me. You can do this for me. For us, Katerina." His breaths came faster, his nostrils flaring as he strained towards her, fighting the woman as she gripped his chest and throat. If he didn't calm down soon, he would pass out. She took a step towards him. The violet-eyed man held a hand up, a warning she found difficult to heed as Guillaume clawed at his dark hair and gritted his teeth, snarling through them. "I'm sick of this," Guillaume muttered, and as quickly as his strength had returned, it faded. He sagged against the woman, his breath shallow and uneven. "Sick of it." "Guillaume!" Katerina reached for him, her brow furrowing, chest tightening as his eyes dulled again. Her gaze darted to the man and then the woman, her pulse racing in her ears as fear got the better of her. "He needs to rest, please."
"Lisabetta, take the young man to rest."
The black-haired man regally waved his hand, and the beautiful silver-eyed woman nodded gracefully and led Guillaume away, ushering him towards Katerina. When he neared her, Katerina reached out and brushed his hand with hers, met his gaze and hoped he saw in her eyes that it would all work out. Everything would be fine. She would save him, just as she had promised all those years ago. Although she wasn't sure she would be able to live with herself. Marek had done nothing wrong in her eyes. He had done nothing to deserve what she was going to do to him for the sake of her brother. She tamped down her rebellious feelings and focused on Guillaume, on fulfilling that promise. She had to do this. The man withdrew a slender wooden box from his coat pocket and opened it. Her pulse jacked up as he carefully lifted a syringe from its bed of black velvet. The dark liquid it contained was thick and syrupy as the man turned it so the needle was pointing towards the ceiling, and rested his thumb against the bottom of the syringe.
"What is that? The cure?"
She found herself leaning forwards as that thought struck her, the hope he had pieced back together growing stronger as she convinced herself that it was. Saving her brother was there within her reach. The man disappeared in a plume of violet and black smoke that sparked with purple lightning, and she gasped as he reappeared behind her, his free hand closing over the front of her throat before she could move.
"No,"
he purred into her ear.
"An insurance policy."
She flinched as he stabbed her with the needle, the world going silent for a moment as her ears rang, and then panic flared, adrenaline crashing through her as her mind caught up and screamed at her to get away. She struggled against his hold, elbowing him in the ribs with her left arm, but he tightened his grip on her throat. She choked and gasped for air, her eyes watering as her throat burned and a strange cold ran outwards from the point where the needle had pierced her arm.
"This is just in case the feelings you have for the god grow stronger than the love you have for your brother. Or you develop a conscience."
He eased his grip on her throat as she gave up fighting him, his voice as smooth as honey, sweet enough to soothe the edges of her fear as he withdrew the needle.
"Only I can cure this infection."
Her pulse spiked right back up, her eyes shooting wide.
"Infection?"
The man stroked her throat, slowly, gently, and the cold that had been rolling through her turned to warmth. She tried to pull away from him, but he caged her against him, and she was glad for his hold on her when her legs buckled, suddenly giving out beneath her.
In my experience, people tend to care more about themselves than anyone else.
He banded one arm around her waist and maneuvered her onto a wooden chair at the table. When she was settled on it, he crouched before her and looked deep into her eyes, his leaping between them. He touched her forehead and she shivered, the cool touch against her burning flesh sheer bliss.
This way, you will do as I want.
I was going to do what you wanted anyway.
She shoved at him, knocking him back a step, and regretted it when the delicious cool of his hand left her skin, and she burned up all over again.
The male is resting.
Lisabetta stepped into the kitchen, looked between her and the man, and frowned.
It is done?
He nodded. Her face blackened.
You said you would not do it alone. Did you lay hands upon her?
He smiled, a mixture of amusement and irritation in it.
Dear Lisabetta, you know my heart belongs to you. I only did what I had to for the cause.
Katerina wasn't interested in their lovers' spat. She stared at the empty syringe on the table, panic mounting again as she thought about the dark liquid that had been in it and was now in her. Sweat dotted her brow, and she swore someone had turned the temperature up. She swiped the back of her hand across her forehead and swallowed, unsuccessfully attempting to wet her parched throat. She needed water. She tried to stand and collapsed onto the floor at the man's feet. He sighed, picked her up, and set her back down on the chair.
Things are progressing more swiftly than she believed they would. This is concerning.
What did you give me?
Katerina slurred, shoving both of her hands against his chest to push him away from her. This time he didn't budge, not because he was exerting any strength to resist her, but because she was too weak. Her hands shook violently against his chest, and it took all of her strength to keep them there and stop them from falling limply onto her lap.
A cocktail of blood, donated from various demons in our collective.
His words wobbled in her ears, but she understood them enough that a chill swept through her, a brief reprieve from the fire that was blazing in her veins, burning up her skin. He pressed his hand to her forehead again, and she leaned into it, desperate for the coolness of his touch, her eyes slipping shut despite what he said next.
It will not be long before you start exhibiting symptoms. Best you get moving, Katerina, because the one thing I know about this god, he despises demons just as deeply as his brothers and his father.
She shuddered as his words swam in her ears, the warning they contained not lost on her, because she had witnessed Marek's hatred of demons. It had shown in his eyes when he had spoken of them. It ran as deep as his hatred of vampires.
The demon infection might kill her if I do not draw it out of her soon. The dose was too strong. She messed it up.
The man looked at Lisabetta, a flicker of what might have passed as concern in his eyes. Katerina doubted the concern was for her. He was worried that Marek might see what she was becoming before she could do as he wanted and lure him into a trap. His violet gaze shifted back to her and hardened again, even as his voice softened to lull her.
You must work fast, Katerina. What will happen to your brother if you die?
Katerina shook as she imagined Guillaume alone in this world. He would lose his way, would slip into the darkness like the other vampires. He needed her to be strong, brave, and to do whatever was necessary to save him. She would be all those things for him. She would do what he needed. She didn't know Marek, not really. She kept telling herself that, but it didn't settle the sickness brewing in her stomach. The man rose to his feet and held his hand out to Lisabetta. She slipped hers into it and stepped up to him, her black lips stretching into a satisfied smile as he wrapped his arm around her. Behind him, purple-black smoke swirled, spreading outwards like clouds laced with green and violet lightning, until it was taller than he was and wider than both of them.
Move swiftly, Katerina.
He stepped backwards with the woman into the smoke, his voice lingering in the room as it dissipated to leave her alone in it. Her stomach twisted, every muscle in her body spasming as she bent over and retched, dry heaving between her knees. She wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering as she struggled to hold herself together. She was falling apart. She swore she could feel it as pieces of her fell away. A voice sounded in her ears, or perhaps she was imagining it. Her hearing was distorted, nothing more than white noise as she held on to herself. She didn't resist as arms lifted her, cradling her aching body against a cool chest. She slumped into it, seeking the cold to ease the burning in her blood. A cry rolled up her throat as her muscles spasmed again, cramping so hard she felt sure her bones would break. Her breath shortened with each terrible shudder that racked her, which left her feeling more brittle, on the verge of dying.
"Shh, Katerina," Guillaume's sweet voice. "I'll take care of you."
Tears lined her eyes, hot against her skin despite the fact she was burning up, and she sagged against him.
"Rest now."
Those words were black magic, reaching deep into her soul to loosen the part of her that was clinging to consciousness. She dropped into the welcoming darkness. Chapter 12. Katerina's stomach cramped despite the 2 burgers and large fries she had devoured. She rubbed it through her black tank, trying to ease the cramp even when she knew it was impossible. After waking from what Guillaume had told her had been a 3-day sleep, she hadn't felt at all as she had expected based on how she had felt before she had passed out. She felt strong and ravenous. No matter how much she ate, it only ever took the edge off her hunger. It never satisfied it. It never tasted right. Juicy steak, tapas of every variety, fast food. She had tried it all, and all of it lacked whatever it was her body now demanded. She craved something else. She wasn't sure what, and part of her didn't want to contemplate it. She moved along the Ramblas, a broad street that cut through the heart of Barcelona, stretching from the huge Plaza de Catalunya in the center of the main tourist area down to the harbor. The hour was early, the stores that set up along the wide tree-lined pedestrian avenue that ran along the center of it still open and doing business. Cars passed along the single-lane roads on either side of her, the pavements beyond them busy with tourists and locals. The heat of the day was breaking as night closed in, and everyone seemed determined to take advantage of it, which had drawn out more than just the local pickpockets who lurked beneath the trees and blended with the crowd, determined to take their fill tonight. She had spotted at least one vampire lurking in the shadow of a building, avoiding the weak evening light. The woman had been watching the crowd as it moved across the entrance to the market. Katerina had studied her for a while before moving on. She wouldn't find her quarry by tracking a single vampire. Marek would be hunting for a group of them, the ones who had been at the nest that night they had met. They had killed 5 of them that night, and a further 3 the next night. That left 4 from the original nest. She scanned the crowd, sure they would be hunting tonight. It was so busy on the Ramblas that it was like a buffet for the vampires. They could easily pick out some prime prey to follow down one of the many roads that led off the main avenue, and there was plenty of dark corners on those roads for pulling prey into for a quick bite to eat. A multicolored haze suddenly appeared over all the people around her, and she stopped dead, her heart hammering so fast she felt sick as she blinked. The colors didn't disappear as expected. Katerina pressed her hand to her head and moved to the nearest tree, rested her back against the rough bark as she breathed, waiting for the weird spell to pass. It grew stronger as she settled, and the panic started to fade as she began to track a few of the passing people and realize something. The colors changed as they spoke to their friends, the shimmering halos that surrounded them shifting as their expressions altered, and sometimes when they didn't. Was she seeing emotions? She shook her head at that. It wasn't possible. She was just tired still, overwrought and stressed out because she was a walking carrier of demon blood, and getting her life back depended on her finding a man who she had stood up several days ago, one who probably never wanted to see her again now. The colors remained, mocking her. They continued to change, one hue morphing into another. Red, green, blue, violet. Even a shadowy sort of black. That one clung to a man who was loitering on the other side of the pedestrian area to her, his eyes scanning the crowd. Could she see evil intent? What demon had this ability come from? The man had given her a cocktail of them, apparently. How many abilities could she expect to experience before she finally got the cure, or died? Katerina sucked down a breath.
Not necessarily die. He said I might die.
Which meant she might live. Her body might be able to absorb all these new abilities, and she might emerge from the process as something new, but something that was no doubt going to be a demon. So just rolling with the punches wasn't going to happen. She needed to find Marek and get the cure and save her brother. She was not going to become a demon, not when her brother was going to emerge from the darkness at last, free of its stain and able to live his life again, as a human. Katerina forced herself to keep moving. She was wasting time. She needed to find Marek, and, well, she wasn't sure what her plan was. Finding Marek was step one. She was sure step two would come to her once she had achieved step one. She wasn't even sure he was in Barcelona. She took a left, crossing the road to follow the pedestrian shopping street that would take her to the Plaza Real. When she reached it, she slowed her steps, scouting the corners of the busy square. She did a lap, ignoring all the street vendors who tried to sell to her and the waiters offering her dinner. She wasn't hungry. Not for food, anyway. She idly rubbed her stomach as she left the square and headed back towards the nest. The wooden door was ajar when she reached it. Katerina paused and listened, and heard everything. Her eyes widened as a cacophony of sounds reached her ears. People talking, cars moving, creatures scurrying, someone breathing. She heard it all as if it was happening right next to her. Heat bloomed in her face, rapidly building into an inferno, and she reached out to her right and pressed her hand to the wall to steady herself as her head spun. This wasn't good. Voices came from behind her, and panic set her feet to autopilot. She stumbled inside the nest, closing the heavy door behind her and resting her back against it as she breathed, focusing on each one in an attempt to settle herself. She was strong. She could survive this. She cursed the man, cursed him again when the first one didn't satisfy her in the slightest. The dose had been too damned strong. How was she meant to get anywhere with Marek when she felt as if she was going to collapse at any second? "Katerina?" His deep voice rolled over her, and she thought she was imagining it at first, was hearing it because part of her was desperate to see him again, and not because she wanted to get her cure and save her brother. He hunted demons. He could tell her what the man had done to her, what she could expect to happen. She crushed that thought. She couldn't tell him, not because telling him would mean no cure for her or her brother, but because he would kill her. She was becoming a demon now. It made things easier for her in a way. There was no point in falling for a man who would hunt and kill her if he knew what she was becoming. "You never showed." He had moved closer, his voice louder now, holding a hard note that spoke of irritation and disappointment. She slowly opened her eyes, wanting to know what colors those emotions were. Apparently, they were no color at all, or her new ability was broken. "Sorry," she murmured and resisted the temptation to peer more closely at him, to see if she could make the colors appear. "I didn't mean to." Maybe she could switch it on and off? She pushed away from the door. Her legs were steadier, and the heat that gripped her was breaking. That was good. Maybe he wouldn't notice something was wrong with her. "Your cheeks are flushed." He inched closer, his dark eyebrows drawing down as he pointed to her face. "Are you sick?" She nodded. More sick than he knew. More sick than she wanted him to know. She pressed the back of her hand to her right cheek. "I've been under the weather. It's the only reason you beat me to these vampires." She didn't look at the two bodies that were fizzing just behind him, one slumped over the other. Marek did. He cast them a black look. "They were foolish enough to return. One even gave up another location for us to check." Katerina clung to that word. Us. Marek wasn't going to push her away because she had stood him up. That was good, wasn't it? So why did part of her want to scream at him that he needed to get away from her? She shut that part of her heart down and tried not to let it affect her. She had to save Guillaume. She did look at the slain vampires now. If she didn't, Guillaume might end up like them, killed and left to rot away and turn to dust, slaughtered by a god with a vendetta. She could recognize one when she saw one. She had been treading the same angry path as him, was still treading it. Even if she managed to save Guillaume, the compulsion to destroy vampires would still have its claws in her. She knew that. Even if she managed to save Guillaume. She frowned. When she saved Guillaume. She stared at the decaying bodies, fear-snaking black tendrils around her heart as they rapidly disintegrated, as Marek cleaned his knife on the clothing of the one on top and sheathed it. Would Guillaume stay home tonight as she had asked? She didn't want him visiting the bars as he often did, drawn to them by the overpowering need for blood. She didn't want him out in the city when Marek was in it. What if they crossed paths? She shook at the thought, limbs trembling as the tendrils of fear became icy claws that sunk into her heart. "If you are sick, you should be resting." Marek's palm brushed her cheek, the sudden heat of him sending a wave of panic crashing over her. She hadn't noticed him closing the distance between them. She slapped his hand away, the fear sinking so deep into her now that she wanted to bolt. She couldn't let him touch her. She had let him touch her. Did he know what she was now? Her eyes leaped to his, despite the part of her that was afraid of what she might see in them. He frowned at the hand she had smacked away, and then his rugged features softened as his gaze drifted to meet hers, his eyebrows furrowing slightly.
I might make you sick,
she stuttered, latching onto that excuse and hoping he bought it.
"I can't get sick."
He curled his hand into a fist and lowered it to his side.
"Because you're a god,"
she whispered, and regretted it when his face darkened, his eyes shifting towards black as suspicion formed in them. Damn. She needed to explain herself, and fast, before he called her on the fact she knew what he was when he had never told her.
"You talked about the underworld and Olympus, and about gods and things. I thought perhaps because you hunt demons you are a god. You seem strong enough to be one."
And clever enough to see right through that weak compliment to the truth she was trying to hide. He said nothing, just kept looking at her, scrutinizing her as she sweated. She rubbed her forehead again, grimaced as her hand came away slick. The weird color haze popped into existence around him, a red shimmer with dashes of black and gold. She had no clue what that meant. Was it a bad sign or a good one? The damned bastard who had done this to her could have at least given her a breakdown of what to expect. This could be a power that would be handy in her mission to lure Marek for him. She wanted to vomit at that thought. Or maybe she just wanted to vomit. Her stomach cramped hard. She doubled over.
"Katerina, you are sick. You must rest."
Marek reached for her and hesitated before placing his hand on her shoulder. It was only a brief pause, but he had hesitated to touch her. She was already screwing this up, pushing him away when she was meant to be drawing him closer. Because now that she was with him again, there was a part of her that wasn't sure she could go through with it, that didn't want to do this to him. He rubbed her back, gentle soothing circles over her tank that had her breath coming more easily, and the pain subsiding as she focused on them.
"It'll pass,"
she hoped. She braced her hands against her black jeans-clad knees and gave herself a moment. It had nothing to do with how good it felt to have Marek's hand on her, his light touch filled with concern. She closed her eyes and hung her head, so her fair hair concealed her face from him and she could wage war with herself in private, without giving everything away. She had to do this. It was Marek or her brother. Katerina straightened and Marek's hand slid to her shoulder. He helped her up, held her as she waited for a dizzy spell to pass, and did his best to make this all so much harder on her as he smiled, worry shining in his dark eyes. She looked away before she could fall into them and under his spell.
"2 more to go, then."
His gaze didn't leave her face.
"More than 2, according to the intel one of them gave to me in the hope I would let him go. He mentioned fresh recruits and some more rolling in from the countryside."
"Why are so many of them gathering in the city?"
She risked meeting his gaze again, and the heat that swept through her this time had nothing to do with the demon blood in her veins.
"I've never seen activity like this before."
Marek pivoted away from her and crossed the courtyard to the decaying corpses, his boots loud on the flagstones, filling the silence that felt too tense to her. He squatted next to the dead vampires and studied them.
"Sometimes rats gather together. Maybe they think there's safety in numbers."
He chuckled, the sinister sound sending a chill tumbling down her spine as something dawned on her. He relished the fact the vampires were gathering, because it made it easier for him to kill them.
"Why do you hunt vampires?"
She couldn't stop that question from leaving her lips as she stared at him. He didn't look at her as he stood, his eyes remaining locked on the vampires lying dead at his feet, a place he clearly believed they belonged. His eyebrows drew down, and that aura that flickered around him shimmered with shades of crimson, tinted with flares of blue, and then it went pitch black. He turned cold eyes on her, ones that revealed none of what he was feeling.
I have to go.
Meet me tomorrow here at 8,
she blurted, afraid she had done something wrong and was going to lose her chance to save her brother, afraid she wouldn't see Marek again. He hesitated, nodded, looked down at the vampires and then at her, and she felt sure he wanted to say something. He disappeared, leaving wisps of black smoke behind. Katerina sagged against the door, her breath leaving her in a rush as her tension bled out of her. She mulled over what she had learned tonight. The man hadn't lied to her. Marek was a god. He hadn't denied it when she had called him on it. What sort of god was he? She doubted he was anything like the man who had done this to her. There was darkness in Marek, but that man had been cruel, a twisted sort of dark that still set her on edge even now, and had her doubting that he would keep his word even if she did what he wanted. Another wave of nausea hit her and she breathed through it. Would the sickness ever pass? Did she want it to? If it passed, it might mean she was a demon now, no longer just a human with an infection that could be cured. She looked down at herself. What sort of demon would she be? She had pondered that question more than once since waking to find Guillaume watching over her, preparing herself for the worst in case the man had lied and couldn't cure her. Her brother had asked her what had happened, and she hated herself for lying to him. She didn't want him to worry about her. That didn't stop him. He had fussed over her every night since the man had visited them, had tried to keep her from going out. When she had explained that she had to go or she couldn't save him, he had relented. Whenever she returned from searching for Marek, Guillaume questioned her all over again, and she went to bed with guilt churning her stomach to burning acid that wouldn't let her sleep. Not only because she was lying to her brother, but because she was doing something terrible. She killed monsters, and now she was going to help them? The man and Lisabetta were monsters. She was sure of that. They were evil. Marek was darkness, a warrior born of shadows, but he was nothing like them. How was she meant to hand him over to them? She closed her eyes and thought of Guillaume. She would do it for him. And when he asked her tonight where she had been and what she had been doing, and why she was still sick, she would lie to him. Because she had to protect him, and she felt sure that if he knew what she was involved in, he would try to protect her by getting involved, which would put him in Marek's firing line. And she knew in her heart what would happen then. Marek would kill him, and that would kill her. Chapter 13. Leaving Katerina last night had been difficult, but Marek had done it for her sake. If he had stayed, she would have wanted to hunt the other vampires, and as far as he could tell, she had been in no fit state to fight. She would have been vulnerable, and would have ended up injured or worse. He leaned back in his leather executive chair and stretched, reaching his arms above his head as he stared at the 3 monitors mounted on his desk. His back ached from sitting for so long, muscles stiff from hunching over the keyboard. And for what? He was no closer to discovering if there was a hellspawn among the ranks of their enemy. Escher and Diamond had filed their nightly reports, both of which had amounted to one line: no activity at the gate. Tokyo and Hong Kong had passed a quiet night, the 4th in a row. That was unusual in itself. It was rare to go more than a night without a hellspawn wanting access to the underworld or the city on the mortal side of the gate. Several of the gates had been too quiet. New York was heading towards a week without any activity. Not even demons sniffing around when Ares had gone to check the gate still worked. Marek didn't like it. Karis wasn't interested in listening to any theories on the matter, though, not when traffic through the Paris and London gates was at an all-time high, and Valen was experiencing more than one call out a night, too. The Seville gate had been quiet last night, but the 3 previous nights it had called him to it and a hellspawn had been waiting for him to open it. No demons in the vicinity either. It was almost business as usual, which set Marek on edge. It felt as if someone was trying too hard to make them relax their guard. It wasn't going to happen, not since the enemy had somehow activated the twin gate in Seville. Marek wasn't letting his guard down again, not until this was all over and his enemy was no more, and the threat to his world and this one was eradicated with them. He pushed to his feet and padded barefoot from his office, banking left as he reached the living room and heading towards his bedroom. He looked at the combat clothing he had laid out on his bed, the black almost blending with the dark blue covers. It had been another hot day, and according to the weather report he had watched, it was sweltering in Barcelona. Marek looked down at his charcoal linen trousers. He really didn't want to gear up tonight, when all he planned to do was some light recon work. The material of his fatigues was heavy. The cotton so thick it would trap his body heat and probably make him feel as if he was slowly boiling to death in his own clothing. He turned away from the bedroom, headed towards the back door beside the unlit stone fireplace at the other end of the living room, and grabbed his sandals. He slipped them on, fastened them, and scrubbed a hand over his hair, neatening the wild waves so he didn't look as if he had been running his fingers through them all day, worrying them as he had carried out another long stretch of sifting through files on the servers looking for clues. He fastened a few more buttons on his black linen shirt, debated unrolling the sleeves, and then blew out his breath and stepped. Katerina gasped and whirled to face him, putting her back to the arched wooden door.
Deu, you frightened me.
Sorry, I thought I would be first here, since he had left a good 30 minutes before they had agreed to meet. He tilted his head back and looked up at the clouds that were beginning to gather threads of gold and pink as the evening encroached. He was definitely early. He looked back at Katerina. A hint of rose climbed her cheeks.
I wanted to take another look around.
She had been as eager as he was to get going. Or had she been eager to see him again? He had been eager to see her. He closed the distance between them, brushing off the lingering ribbons of black from the teleport as he went, aware of how much she didn't like them. They were gone by the time he reached her, by the time he lifted his hand and swept his fingers across her cheek. You look better today. He stroked his fingers down to her jaw, pressed two beneath it, and gently tipped her head up. Although you are still a little pale.
It's just flu or something.
She pulled away from him. I told you I can't get sick. You don't have to worry about passing it to me. She muttered.
That must be nice.
She rubbed her hand against her bare arm, and he frowned as he noticed that she wasn't wearing her leather jacket or her sword. She wasn't planning on fighting tonight either. That eased his mind. He was glad she knew her limits and wasn't as reckless as he had thought.
Where do you pop in from?
She glanced at him.
When you teleport.
Seville. He didn't see the point in hiding things from her, not when she already knew he was a god.
I've fought vampires there before.
She moved past him, but he didn't miss the way she looked him over. His blood heated at that subtle sweep of her eyes over his body, and he found it hard not to give her the same long and leisurely look over. To think, I could have run into you on my turf. He turned to track her as she meandered around the courtyard, traced her profile as she tilted her head back to gaze at the sky, her long caramel-colored hair falling from her slender shoulders to brush the back of her black tank. We could have met years ago.
I would have liked that.
Her faint smile had him taking a step towards her as concern washed through him. He had thought her brighter today, recovering from whatever sickness weakened her, but she looked so somber as she stared at the evening sky, felt so distant from him, and resigned. Katerina. He slid his hand along her elbow and gently cupped her left arm. She glanced down at his hand and then up at his face, a myriad of feelings in her eyes that were impossible to decipher. Other than that terrible resignation he didn't want to see in them. Is something wrong? She stared at him for long seconds, then shook her head, forced a smile.
I think I'm just tired. This infection is taking its toll on me. I'm sorry, I'm not much company.
Infection. She had said it was influenza before. Influenza was a virus, not an infection. Perhaps she was just more tired than she looked and was struggling to think straight. That had him wanting to take her home and make her rest, to tuck her into his bed and sit with her until she had recovered. They could talk, while away the hours by learning more about each other. He would like that.
Are we hunting vampires tonight or not?
Katerina breezed past him, paused at the wooden door and looked back at him.
I want to get going.
It's a long walk to the location I was given. I could teleport you. He went around in circles, debating that in his head. Was she strong enough to survive a teleport? Her cheeks were flushed again as she stared at his body. and he wasn't sure whether it was because she was sick or because she was recalling the last time he had teleported her somewhere, to a dark roof where they had made love.
I'll walk. I need the air.
She held her hand out to him.
Come on, I want to get away from this place.
He walked to her and she dropped her hand to her side as he reached her. Not that he had intended to take it and hold it or anything. He looked down at it as she exited the courtyard. Did she want him to take it? Would she find it comforting? He made the mistake of glancing up at her, and his gaze caught on her breasts, on the fine sheen of sweat that glistened on her modest cleavage as she fanned herself with her hand.
The city is too damned hot tonight,
she muttered and took hold of the front of her tank top and waved it back and forth as she walked along the alley. Gods, she would be his undoing. He spotted a convenience store ahead of them on the road and hurried towards the refrigerated cabinet near the entrance. He grabbed 2 bottles of water, tossed the cashier some money, and was back outside before Katerina had reached the door. He held one of the ice-cold bottles out to her.
My hero,
she murmured, a genuine smile curling her lips as she took the water from him. She closed her eyes, tilted her head back, and pressed the bottle to her neck. The half-sigh, half-moan that left her lips transported him back to the dark rooftop. She stilled and slowly opened her eyes. They locked on him, and a flush touched her cheeks. Nothing to do with her sickness this time. She was remembering that moment, too. It was there in her hazel eyes as her pupils dilated, darkening them. An unsettling swirling sensation formed in his stomach. The coppery odor of demons hit him. Marek's focus whipped to the one standing at the other end of the street, her glowing yellow eyes fixed on Katerina. He reached out with his senses, sharpening them as he slowly reached for Katerina's arm. His internal radar pinged 3 demons, all of them strong. Damn it. He looked at Katerina. He couldn't teleport her, not when he wasn't sure she would survive it. He couldn't fight where he was either, exposed to the eyes of too many mortals. And he couldn't leave her behind, because the demons had seen her with him and were sure to target her. He scooped her up into his arms, tearing a gasp from her, and launched into a dead sprint towards the opposite end of the alley. 2 more demons stepped out in front of him, and he barreled past them. He banked sharply right as he hit the small square beyond them and hoofed it down the busy road, trying not to jostle Katerina too badly. Mortals paused to stare as he ran past them, as he dodged and weaved through the cars to reach the other side of the road, hoping that it would slow the demons down.
Marek?
Katerina sounded panicked as she gripped his shoulders and pulled herself up. He glanced down at her, finding her looking over his shoulder.
They're closing in.
Her eyes darted to his, wide and luminous pools that reflected the fear he could feel in her.
They're not vampires.
Demons, he barked as he kicked off and launched over a car, landing on the roof before pressing down hard with his foot and leaping again.
They look human.
Katerina clung to him, her fingers digging in hard. He landed in a clearing between a car and a bus, fielding a lot of shocked looks from the occupants, and growled as he pushed himself harder, reaching for a little more speed, just enough to get Katerina somewhere safe without the demons noticing. If he could hide her, he could fight them without worrying about her safety. She was a liability as it stood right now, a distraction he couldn't afford in a fight against 3 demons. Katerina shrieked, the sound a knife through his heart, and his senses blared a warning. He dodged right, cutting in front of a van, and a muffled grunt and the screeching of tires was like music to his ears. The demons had to be some sort of higher form of shifter, possibly one of the ugly sorts who wore human skin to hide their scales, horns, and pointed protrusions that made them resemble lizards. He would find out if he could land a blow on one. He focused on the ground beneath him, on the sand and earth hidden below the stone pavement, summoning his connection to it. It flooded him with warmth, the lingering heat of day. Each step he took shook the earth, had the pavement bucking as he left it behind, forming a jagged surface in his wake that he hoped would slow the demons down. Salt laced the thick air, and he frowned as people screamed ahead of him and behind him, rushing for cover as the building shook and the ground bucked harder. Car horns blared, dogs barked. One slipped its leash and bolted past him. Marek didn't care. All he cared about was that he was running out of road. The ocean loomed ahead of him. Golden streaks chased over the waves. He grinned. The demons were strong, but were they strong enough to handle a direct dose of evening sunlight? The area where they had ambushed him had been a network of alleyways, providing them with enough shadows to move without fear of the setting sun. The beach was another matter. It stretched before him, a golden swath of sand that had looked like a dead end at first, but now looked like the perfect battleground. Even if the demons could withstand the fading light, they would be weakened by it, giving him the advantage. Hiding Katerina took a back seat as he put his new plan into action. He focused on the path before him, sending a shockwave across the earth to shake the pavement in all directions, right down to the sea. The humans scattered as planned, several of them leaving their vehicles to run for cover. The streets emptied. Perfect. He broke out into the light and switched his focus to the demons, tracking them as they pursued him, waiting to see what they would do. Only one of them hesitated as they reached the edge of the shadows. The other two stayed firmly on his heels.
They're still close. Can you go faster?
Katerina breathed in his ear. He arched an eyebrow at her. I could drop some ballast. Her eyes widened and she clung to him.
Don't you dare!
Marek tried not to savor the feel of her arms around him or how she held on to him, trusting him to protect her and revealing that she wanted to remain close to him. Tried and failed. His feet hit the sand. He pivoted to face the demons, lowering Katerina at the same time. The blonde female's yellow eyes fixed on her, and she hissed as her claws extended, flaring from her fingertips like talons. Marek gripped Katerina's hip and went to guide her behind him. A brunette female appeared right next to her. Everything slowed as he grabbed Katerina's right arm, as he pulled her towards him. As the demon's claws cut across Katerina's left arm, slicing through the healing scar that darted over her biceps. Her cry ripped at him, the pain that crumpled her face tearing at his heart and stirring the darkness within him, whipping it into a tempest that had a snarl peeling from his lips as he launched a hand out at the demon. Katerina stumbled backwards, clutching her arm, and the sight of the blood seeping from between her fingers pushed him over the edge. He raised his right hand, and 100 spears of sand burst from the beach, each jagged shard razor-sharp on two sides. The blonde demon nimbly dodged them all, fast on her feet, but the brunette didn't fare so well. One of the blades cut up the side of her thigh, spilling her vile black blood. The stench of it had the darkness pushing harder, stealing more control from him. He focused on the brunette, casting a wave of sand at her. She brought her arms up to protect her face, but the weight of it took her down, burying her in a pile at least a foot deep. He turned on the blonde, not surprised to find she was alone. The third demon had turned back, fleeing for the shadows. Marek needed to wrap this up fast, before darkness fell and that demon joined the fight again, and so he could check on Katerina. She muttered curses behind him, the sound of them reassuring him that she was fine, but a little angry.
If I had my blade,
she growled, and he tossed her a look that said even if she had been armed, he wouldn't have let her fight. Not this time. Vampires were strong, but these demons were stronger, and they had built-in weaponry. The blonde lashed at him with her claws, driving him back towards Katerina, so she could get a shot at her. It wasn't going to happen. Marek used telekinesis to throw sand in her face, and his power to summon a wall around Katerina, one that closed her in on all sides and was 3 feet of baked solid earth, far too tough for a demon to penetrate.
What the hell?
Katerina's voice rose over the high wall.
Marek?
I'll explain later. Little busy. The demon recovered, launching herself at him on a vicious snarl that flashed twin rows of sharp teeth. Her lips peeled back from them, her smile so wide it almost reached her ears as they grew pointed. He backhanded her, sending her tumbling into the second demon as she managed to claw her way out of the sand. No longer looking human. Dark burgundy scales covered every inch of her, a contrast to the pale bony protrusions on her elbows and shoulders, and the line of spikes down her spine, and the 3 horns that flared back from either side of her head. Her tongue flickered out, forked and black, and her yellow eyes dimmed as a film closed over them from the outer edge of her eyes towards the twin holes that now passed as her nose. At least he knew for sure they were one of the lizard-like shifter breeds, which meant conventional means of attacking them was out of the window. They possessed the ability to harden their scales, protecting them from blows that would otherwise sever a limb or pierce an organ. But they could only shield small areas at a time, not the whole of their body. So he just needed to hit them with an attack that would rip through every inch of them, and then he was sure to deliver a fatal blow. Or he needed to knock them out. Marek focused on the blonde as the other demon made a break for the high wall he had built around a now furious Katerina. She hollered abuse at him, banging on the thick, curving wall. He dodged the blow the blonde aimed at him and teleported behind her, grabbed her from behind, and got her into a chokehold. He gripped his wrist, pulling hard on it so his forearm dug into her throat. She wriggled and snarled as he heaved backwards, lifting her feet from the sand. Sharp pain shot in a line down his chest. Son of a... He tossed her aside and gritted his teeth, fury building inside him as he looked down at his shirt and found a series of holes in it. And his body. The female rolled into a squat and hissed at him, baring fangs as the spikes down her spine retracted. He scuffed sand into her face and followed it as she reared up to avoid it, barreling into her and lifting her from the ground. She clawed at him and he wrestled with her, managed to get hold of both of her wrists and slammed his forehead into hers. Stars winked across his eyes and he was sure his skull had just cracked. But the attack had the desired effect. The blonde hung limp from his arms. Marek released her and swiftly brought both of his hands up. A huge spear of earth shot up, pierced her chest, and lifted her with it as it grew in size and impaled her. She dangled from it, arms and legs splayed, head tilted back, and unseeing eyes fixed on the darkening sky. The other demon halted her attempts to break through the earth wall and looked across at her fallen comrade. Her yellow eyes grew impossibly large and she shrieked, the keening sound hurting his eardrums. He flinched away. She was on him before he could recover, claws shredding his shirt, cutting close to his face. He clenched his jaw and grappled with her, and when catching hold of one of her arms didn't stop her, he twisted and slammed her into the sand. Her breath left her on a fetid rush, carrying the scent of her foul blood. Marek shoved a knee into her chest, pinning her down, and gripped both sides of her head as she struggled and twisted hard. Bones snapped. The demon went limp. He rose to his feet, sucked down a breath to shut down the pain from the lacerations covering every inch of his chest, and exhaled, his shoulders sagging with it as he sensed that he and Katerina were alone. The third demon was long gone. Not a soul other than him and Katerina was in the vicinity. His gaze slowly tracked to the wall that shielded Katerina. She had gone quiet. His senses fixed on her, the need to hear her heart beating and her panicked breaths, to know that she was alive and had survived the fight, overwhelming him. He crossed the stretch of sand between him and her, his pace quickening as he lifted his hand and focused on the thick earth wall.
Marek?
She whispered, fear lacing her voice, tugging at his heart. She worried for him. He couldn't remember the last time a woman had worried about him. A time long ago flashed into his mind, and he barely bit back the need to snarl, because that woman hadn't really cared about him. It had all been a lie, a manipulation. Her betrayal had proven that. I'm fine, Katerina. He couldn't stop those words from leaving his lips, the need to reassure her and soothe her fears pulling them from him, straight up from his heart. A heart that beat with a need to see her, to see that she was fine too. The earth wall cracked, fissures forming as he exerted his will on it, and Katerina gasped as it crumbled before him, a whole section falling away to land with a hard thud on the sand between them. Her eyes leaped from it to him, and the relief that washed across her face flowed through him too, until he noticed that she was still holding her arm. The blood was dark on her skin, turned his stomach, and had his chest tightening as he held his hand out to her, needing her to come to him. She stepped over the remains of the wall and picked her way over the boulders of baked earth, struggling for balance whenever one of the pieces wobbled beneath her weight. Marek met her at the edge of one of the larger sections and took her left hand, holding it gently so he didn't hurt her as he guided her down to the sand. By the time she reached him, the light had faded, but he could still see well enough that he cursed when he removed her hand from her arm and saw the 2 lacerations that cut across her arm. Fucking demons, he snarled and ghosted his thumb over the wounds, a black need to hunt blasting through him as he stared at it. They are vermin worse than the vampires. I will hunt the third one down, and when I catch it, I will tear it apart with my bare hands. Katerina took a step back, the scent of her fear increasing as she covered the wound on her arm again. Her hand shook against it. No, not just her hand. The need pounding in his veins grew darker, more demanding as he realized the whole of her was shaking. Katerina, he murmured, an apology in it because he was sure he was the one who frightened her now. He stepped up to her, cupped her cheek, and stared down into her eyes, fighting for the words he wanted to say to her as feelings collided inside him, a tangle of relief and anger and need. That need built rapidly as he looked at her, as he saw that she was all right, until he could no longer deny it. He dropped his head and pressed his lips to hers, and the rage burning in his blood gave way under the sweet relief that rushed through him when she kissed him back, her mouth playing against his, the softness of her kiss chasing the darkness from his heart and filling it with light. Marek sank into the kiss, drew her closer, and deepened it. Her tongue tangled with his. A strange sensation swept through him, and he frowned as it grew stronger, unsettling him even when he couldn't put his finger on what it was that was wrong. He frowned as he kissed her, as she pressed closer and took hold of him, her hands trembling as she gripped his biceps. Her need rolled through him, drugging him with the thought of satisfying it for her, of satisfying both of them. But the weird feeling grew stronger and stronger, and then it hit him. She tasted different, wrong. He pulled back as every instinct fired inside him, grabbed her by her arms and shoved her away from him. The scent that had been building around her, triggering one of his deepest instincts, grew so strong that he couldn't deny it, even when part of him desperately wanted to, was seeking excuses even as the truth hit him like a 1-2 punch in the chest from a gorgon. Marek stared at her arm where he gripped it, at the blood that eased from between his fingers and trickled down her arm. She couldn't be. He brought that hand away from her, turned it towards him and stared at it in the low light. It shook, trembling so badly he couldn't focus on it as he splayed his fingers, as he drew down a deep breath to catch the scent of her blood. 3 words ran around his head on repeat. Please be wrong. He lifted his hand to his face and sniffed. The vile edge to the coppery scent of her blood was unmistakable. Demon! He shoved her backwards, sending her staggering over the mounds of earth blocks. She stumbled and fell, landed hard on her back on the sand, her breath leaving her on a pained cry that ripped at his heart. He slammed the door to it shut, refusing to let her effect it. Tears glistened on her cheeks as she struggled to her feet, the hurt in her hazel eyes threatening to break down the barriers the darker side of him had constructed around his heart and built between them. She brushed the tangled waves of her caramel hair from her face, and the pain that had been in her eyes morphed to fear and then something else. You didn't seem to care about it a moment ago. Her words lashed at him, fury making each one as sharp as a blade, and they cut him deep, severing the part of him that had foolishly clung to the belief that his instincts were mistaken and she wasn't a demon. She clenched her hands at her sides, her fists shaking as she stared him down. Unless that moan had been a protest? She mimicked it. Marek snarled at her, baring his teeth as his canines began to extend, the darker part of him coming to the fore as his entire world seemed to crumble around him. A voice deep within mocked him, hurling images of his past at him and all the lessons he should have learned back then. Never trust women. Never let one into your heart. He felt weak as he stared at her, as he fought the feelings that still burned inside him, refusing to die even as he tried to vanquish them. They weren't real. Everything between them had been a lie, a manipulation, and he'd fallen for it all over again. His heart caught fire, the flames as black as midnight, rapidly consuming it and replacing his softer emotions, his weaker self, with emptiness that morphed into a rage so deep he lost control. On a vicious growl, he stepped and appeared right in front of her. He launched his bloodied right hand out and gripped her throat, tore a terrified gasp from her as he lifted her feet from the sand and held her aloft. He stared into her wide eyes and shook her, an anguished snarl peeling from between his clenched teeth as he fought for control, some command over the pain devouring him as it dredged up 1,000 memories he wanted to forget and connected them to the woman before him. Her face crumpled as she fought for breath, her face reddening and legs flailing, her fear hitting him hard and threatening to overwhelm him. He fought it, too, because he wouldn't be weak again. Never again. She lifted her hands and gripped his forearm. You dare touch me, demon! He went to tighten his hold on her, a grip that would choke the last of the air from her lungs. You touched me! She squeezed each word out, the hoarse, wheezy sound of them hitting him hard and rattling him. His eyes leaped to his hand. widened as he saw black claws pressing into her delicate flesh, spilling blood down her neck, and the dark rings of bruises beneath his fingers. He reeled, blinking hard as he dropped her to the sand and stumbled backwards. His ears rang, the darkness that had been consuming every part of him losing its hold as cold swept through him, a numbing sort of iciness that had him close to falling to his knees. Katerina choked down breaths as she rubbed her throat, as tears cut down her cheeks and glistened in the brightening moonlight. Marek reached for her, driven by a need to comfort her, but stopped himself. She was a demon. What was he doing? As her breaths grew stronger, she slowly straightened, and the coldness in her eyes as she fixed them on him sent another wave of chilling ice through his blood. But it was the other feelings he could see in them that had his resolve wavering, his lingering feelings for her breaking through the restraints he had placed on them, fighting every instinct he had and demanding he go to her. Reproach, hurt, fear. Her brow furrowed, and for a heartbeat she looked as if more tears would come. But then she swallowed hard and scrubbed a hand across her cheeks and glared at him.
You kissed me.
She held her throat as she spoke, each hoarse word another blade in his heart, a reminder of what he had done. She was a demon. Everything had been a lie, a manipulation. He clung to that, used it to stoke his fury back to life, until his darker side stirred again, rising to push back against the feelings she was trying to evoke in him. It was a lie. She was still manipulating him, bending him to her will. She was a demon, his sworn enemy. She sucked down another shuddering, wheezing breath. Her fine eyebrows furrowed, the fire in her eyes fading as she looked at him.
I wanted to tell you. Doesn't that count for something?
Her eyes searched his, and he made damn sure she saw only darkness in them, only the side of him that hunted her kind, because it was all she deserved to see. She managed another breath and looked down at her blood-stained hand. Tears cut down her cheeks.
I don't want this. I don't want to be this. I didn't have a choice.
Marek frowned at her. She shook her head, sending more tears tumbling.
I just want things back to how they were,
she whispered, and he wanted to tell her that wasn't possible, because it had all been a lie constructed by her, a demon. She curled her fingers into a fist, and before he could line up the words, she yelled,
I just want this damned blood out of mine.
She disappeared. Marek blinked hard, mind reeling from the shock of seeing her teleport and what she had said. He stared at where she had been, feeling cold from head to toe now that she was gone, even when he had wanted that. Hadn't he? He had wanted her away from him. She was a demon. Her words taunted him. She wanted the blood out of hers. He frowned as he lowered his gaze to the sand just in front of his feet and tracked back over the last 2 days. She had said she was sick, and tonight she had called it an infection. She had been distant, had withdrawn from him more than once, not wanting him to touch her, because she had feared he would discover the demon blood in her. Blood that wasn't her own? Was it possible someone had infected her? His gut twisted at the thought that it might be, the violent way he had reacted to her replaying in his head to twist it tighter still until he felt sick. The way she had looked at him in the moments before she had somehow teleported were branded on his mind and seared on his heart. The pain in her eyes had been genuine, and the fear hadn't stemmed from what he had done to her or what he might do to her. She was afraid of what was happening to her. Her voice echoed in his ears, a desperate declaration that she had wanted to tell him, but she hadn't, because she had known how he would react. He clenched his fists and relished the pain when his short claws cut into his palms, because if his suspicions were right, he deserved to feel it. He wasn't sure he was right, though, or whether this was all another lie, an elaborate one designed to make him believe her so she could get close to him again. Marek shoved his fingers through his hair and pulled it back. He wanted to believe her, and that was a problem. He was too close to this, to her. He couldn't think objectively, was blinded by his feelings for her, but also jaded by his past, and a slave to his instincts. The 3 sides of him made it impossible to look at all the facts without being affected by at least one of them. Which meant one thing. If he was going to discover the truth, he was going to have to do something that might only make things worse. He was going to have to tell his brothers. Chapter 14. Katerina sank to her backside as she appeared on the dark roof close to the beach, shock and adrenaline combining to turn her legs to rubber beneath her. She sat there, thoughts spinning, entire body quaking as she stared blankly ahead of her at the horizon. Had she just teleported? She found that hard to believe, even when all the evidence pointed to yes as the answer to that question. She could teleport now. She moved onto her hands and knees and shuffled to the edge of the roof, not trusting her legs. Her head was fine, wasn't spinning as it did whenever Marek teleported her, but her body felt weak, as if she had just used every drop of energy in it in one go. The lights along the promenade made it difficult to see the beach. She focused on the sand in the direction she thought she had been. The light seemed to dim and the beach brightened. Another power? She peered deeper into the shadows and stopped when her heightened sight revealed Marek where he still stood on the sand, his back to her. Her chest tightened, as painful as her throat as she rubbed it and looked at him. Her mind whirled again, replaying everything that had just happened as she struggled to catch up. One moment she had been in heaven, wrapped up in his arms and the heat of his body against hers, lost in the moment, and then she had been in hell, chilled to the bone by how Marek had reacted to her. Flooded with despair and hurt that cut her so deep she wasn't sure she could recover from it. Did he think this was easy for her? She wanted him so much, and even though she knew it was impossible, now that he was aware of what she was becoming, she still wanted him. But he hated what she was becoming. A demon. He had shown her that tonight, giving her a terrifying and up-close and personal look at the hatred that burned inside him. Her ability to see emotions had chosen that moment to reveal his, showing her the darkness of his feelings in a black aura laced with crimson and green. Colors she presumed signaled fury, loathing, and disgust. She wished that power had remained on the fritz, sparing her to a degree. Hearing the hatred in his voice and seeing it in his eyes had been bad enough. And she hadn't been able to stop herself from reacting, lashing out at him just as he was lashing out at her. A vain attempt to protect her own feelings even when the damage had already been done. She kept rubbing her throat, trying to ease the pain that burned in it. For the first time in her life, Katerina truly hated the world. Because tonight it had hit her that she bore the blood the man she was falling in love with despised above all else. That she was becoming one of those things he had fought. She sank against the low wall that edged the roof, all hope bleeding out of her as something else dawned on her too. Marek would never allow her near him again. How was she meant to fulfill the task the man had given her if Marek hated her now? How was she meant to save her brother, to rid herself of this damned blood? The tears she had been holding back burned her nose and stung her eyes, but she still refused to let them come. She refused to give up, even when she desperately wanted to do that. She had been so afraid when she had been cut tonight and had seen her blood was darker than before, almost as black as the liquid had been in the syringe. She had feared Marek would notice it when he had inspected the cut, had been terrified of showing it to him, even when she had known he would insist and wouldn't rest until he had checked the wound. When he hadn't noticed the change in color, she had been so relieved, had thought everything would be fine. She curled up and stared at him, wishing it had been, wishing he hadn't somehow discovered what she was when he had been kissing her of all things. She could understand his reaction, even when she didn't want to, when she wanted to be furious with him for lashing out at her. Demons were his enemy. She couldn't blame him for thinking she was one of them, but that didn't make it hurt any less. She watched him as he turned to look around him, the need to go to him so strong that she had to hold the wall to anchor herself, had to keep telling herself that it would be a mistake. He wouldn't listen to anything she had to say, and she couldn't tell him everything anyway. If he learned who had done this to her and what they wanted her to do, he would hate her even more. It didn't stop her from wanting to go to him. He ran his hands over his hair and his broad shoulders lifted in a deep sigh. How had she ever thought she could do this? She couldn't. She wouldn't. She didn't want to hand Marek over to that man and the woman who had been with him. She couldn't bear the thought of doing it, or the thought of what they might do to him. Being the instrument of his downfall, seeing him suffer because of her would destroy her. He heaved another long sigh and then disappeared. Katerina slumped against the wall, resting her chin on it as she stared at the dark sea. But what choice did she really have? It was Marek or her brother. Only one of them would survive this. And that broke her heart. Chapter 15. Marek had forced himself to sleep on everything before bringing it to his brothers. Now dawn was coming and he hadn't gotten a wink of sleep, had paced through the night, tormented by what he had done to Katerina, enraged by what she had done to him. He huffed and stalked into the open-plan kitchen next to the living room, poured himself a glass of juice from the refrigerator and downed it. Wearing a groove in the terracotta tiles of his floor wasn't going to solve anything. He was getting nowhere, had gone in circles about Katerina all night. He was finding it harder to think straight now than he had after she had disappeared from the beach. He needed to speak with his brothers. He had written a message to that effect and had almost sent it 3 times, but each time his thumb had hovered over the send button, he had thought about Katerina and what his brothers would do to her if they discovered what she was, which tied him in knots. He was meant to hunt her kind, defending the gates from them, protecting his home from them. Why couldn't he hate her as he hated the other demons? His heart supplied that he knew the answer to that question, because Katerina was different. Wrong. She didn't affect him like other demons did. When he had been with her, he hadn't felt that strange sensation in his gut that warned him when a demon was near him, and she hadn't smelled like a demon when she had been cut, which gave him hope. Hope that Katerina had been telling the truth and that she was somehow infected. He just wasn't sure if that was possible. He pulled the phone from his pocket, brought up the message, and hesitated over the send button again. Was it better he took this to everyone or just one of them? One brother questioning him sounded infinitely more palatable than having 6 brothers questioning him. He immediately discounted Karis, in case his older brother had finally reacted to Enyo visiting him and was in a foul mood. Ares seemed like the best choice, although Ares would tell him what he already knew in his heart. It was best he took this to all of his brothers, just in case it had something to do with their enemy. Just in case? It had all the hallmarks of their enemy. There was no use denying that. He didn't want Katerina to be a demon, and he didn't want her to be working with his enemy. But when had he ever gotten what he wanted? He pressed send on the group message, pivoted on his heel, and went to his bedroom. He grabbed the T-shirt from the clothes still draped over his bed, went into the ensuite, and stripped off his ruined shirt. He tossed it in the bin and washed his chest. The cuts were all healing now, little more than scars. Were Katerina's wounds healing as rapidly? He meant to think about the one on her arm, but instead was hit by an image of her throat, black with bruises, spotted with blood where his claws had pierced her. Marek leaned over the sink, gripped the edges of it, and squeezed his eyes shut. He had dealt her more than just those physical wounds if she had been telling the truth and she was somehow infected with demon blood. He had dealt her emotional blows too, ones that had hit their mark, cutting her deeply judging by the hurt that had been in her eyes and how she had verbally lashed out at him. Would she ever forgive him? He wasn't sure he would deserve it. "Marek?" Ares' deep voice boomed from the living room. "Just a minute." He splashed cold water onto his face and steeled himself as he dried off, as he donned the T-shirt and ran his fingers through his hair. He should have called this meeting hours ago, before he had twisted himself in knots that were so tight and tangled that he couldn't see the ends to pull to loosen them, or had any hope of freeing himself from them. He wouldn't mention Katerina. He would keep his brothers from her. But if she was a demon, he didn't want to think about what would happen then. Ares was in the kitchen when Marek found the courage to emerge from his bedroom. His big brother bent over the refrigerator, humming to himself as he picked through the contents. "Looking for anything particular?" Marek leaned his backside against the rear of the dark cream couch that stood near the fireplace with a matching armchair, facing his brother. "Anything high in carbs?" Ares grinned as he glanced at Marek, but there was an edge to his dark eyes that spoke of pain, possible agony. "Megan is on a health kick. No pizza." Marek shuddered at the same time as his brother. "That is sacrilegious." Like most of his brothers, Marek craved pizza like a fiend, although he shared Valen's love of pasta too, and enjoyed the local cuisine. He could never get enough of Iberico ham and chorizo, and some of the seafood in Spain was to die for. But pizza was godly. "I told her that." Ares shrugged his broad shoulders, rolling them beneath his black dress shirt, and jammed his hands into the pockets of his equally dark jeans as he leaned near the sink, giving up his search. "She doesn't care. Something about watching her weight, which means I get to suffer,
Because she's cranky as hell and I get an earful if I dare to bring pizza home since she refuses to eat it. An enforced diet. Have you tried eating it before coming home? Aries rolled his eyes. She can smell it on me. Reacts like I've been with another woman or some crazy shit like it.
Valen appeared and slumped into the armchair.
What's up?
Discussing Aries' new diet plan. Marek twisted to look over his shoulder at his younger brother.
Megan is on a diet, so I am too, Aries grumbled. No pizza. Shit, that sucks.
Valen mussed his violet hair and sank deeper into the chair as he yawned.
Have you tried convincing her you two can just work off the calories? Believe me, it's our main source of exercise.
Aries grinned now and folded his arms across his chest. His expression sobered.
Not that it's any of your business.
The door beyond the fireplace opened and Diamond poked his head around it. I thought you would be outside. Diamond shut the door behind him, leaving frost glittering on the knob that rapidly turned to dew. He pulled down a breath and sighed it out, his eyes closing and a blissful look crossing his face. Damn, that feels good. How many BTUs is that? Marek had cranked up the air conditioning after he had worked up a sweat pacing a trench into the tiles and had forgotten to turn it down. Before he could answer his brother, Diamond continued. Escher isn't coming. Moon and all that. His white-haired brother waved at the ceiling. It's been a rough night. Not a problem. I should have thought about it before messaging everyone. Marek was doing that a lot lately, messaging before considering all the angles. First he had summoned Callistos to the Seville gate, and now he had probably made Escher feel bad for not being able to leave Tokyo. The full moon wreaked havoc on his brother, pulling at his powers as fiercely as it did the sea, only it turned Escher unpredictable and dangerous, or at least more unpredictable and dangerous than usual. Is Aiko watching him? Marek nodded when Karis and Callistos appeared and was surprised when Karis bowed his head in return, a very civil greeting. Still not mad with him. Something was definitely up. Yeah, but I promised I wouldn't be long. Diamond drifted to the AC unit, his pale blue eyes expressing all the pleasure he took from having it blast cold air directly on him. The Tokyo mansion didn't have such a luxury, and the city was in the grip of a heat wave. Diamond was probably melting while he took care of Escher. Marek wanted to offer to let him go back to Escher, but he had the feeling his brother would wave him away. He was enjoying the reprieve from the heat too much. Of course, Diamond would be cooler in Tokyo if he wasn't wearing a roll-neck, long-sleeved navy top, leather gloves, and black jeans. Old habits died the hardest, like reacting badly to the presence of a demon. Marek cleared his throat, lined up what he wanted to say, and waited for Callistos to get comfortable on the couch. His youngest brother looked tired, his blonde hair in disarray as he stacked all the pillows at one end of the sofa and lay back on them. His blue eyes were stormy as he looked up at Marek, as he scrubbed a hand over the stubble coating his jaw and sighed. There were numerous healing cuts on his face and neck, and a bandage around his left arm peeking from beneath the sleeve of his khaki t-shirt. Karis had a few scratches of his own, including one that darted down his cheek, almost perfectly in line with the neatly clipped angle of his sideburns. That cut sliced into his black hair, too, above the slightly pointed tip of his ear. Karis's green eyes narrowed on him, a silent warning to get on with it. I don't have any fresh intel on our possible hellspawn problem. It seemed like a good place to start, although it had Diamond, Karis, and Aries frowning at him. He didn't give them a chance to start asking why he had summoned them for a meeting. I have a question, and I need you all to answer it. Marek has a question? Diamond's white eyebrows shot up, and he looked to Aries. How is that possible? Marek knows everything. Marek scowled at his younger brother. Not everything. He never said he knew everything. He knows most things. Aries moved past Karis, where he still stood in the center of the room, his green eyes fixed on Marek. That earned Aries a black look, too. I'm being serious. Of course you are, because you're asking for help, and it's weirding me out. Valen used his boots to push some magazines along the wooden coffee table and rested his feet on it. It's weirding you out? Callistos tipped his head back to look at Valen upside down. I never knew him before he attained the knowledge of the ages through rigorous and tedious reading. I've never known him when he was learning shit. This is serious, Marek snapped. and regretted it when everyone fell silent and stared at him as if he had sprouted another two heads. Diamond and Aries looked as if they weren't sure how to handle his outburst.
This is serious.
Valen looked from Callistos to Diamond, his tone mocking, laced with faux shock.
Quick, guys, hit the books. They're just in there. Off you go. I'll wait here.
He jerked his chin towards Marek's office. Karis sighed just as Marek was about to lose his temper. It was enough to have the rest of his brothers turning deadly serious. When Karis sighed, everyone behaved themselves. Even Marek. It was the same effect Hades had when he sighed, because that simple sound was laced with exasperation and a hefty dose of danger even when it was done lightly. What would be a regular sigh for most people? It was a warning that if things continued as they were, someone was liable to lose their head. And that someone wasn't Karis.
Continue.
Karis waved his hand towards him.
Is it possible for a human to turn demon?
Some of the hardest words Marek had ever had to say, and he watched his brothers closely as they left his lips, gauging all of their faces, waiting for a reaction. Karis arched a single black eyebrow.
Perhaps. A vampire can turn a human, infecting them with blood to force a transition from human to vampire.
Marek schooled his features, holding back the scowl that wanted out as his brother spoke casually about vermin, and without even a shred of disgust in his voice.
A demon can be born of a corrupted soul.
Karis's eyebrow lowered, and both of them knitted above his green eyes.
I have never considered it before, but it might be possible for that corruption to occur while the soul is still within a living vessel.
A living vessel, Marek murmured. The knots twisted inside him, pulling tighter as he thought about that. For humans infected by vampires, death was the catalyst of their transformation. What if it was the same for whatever infected Katerina?
What's this all about?
Callistos sat up and hit him with a worried look. Do you think demons are trying to recruit humans by doing something to their souls? Marek looked at all of his brothers, deeply aware of how far south this might go, but needing to tell them more, because he needed them to convince him that Katerina had been telling the truth.
I ran into a mortal female during some patrols.
He left out the fact he had been in Barcelona and he hadn't been hunting for demons, because that way led to more questions, and he needed to keep everyone's focus on Katerina and her possible problem.
Yesterday evening I met her again. She had been sick since the night before that, and had told me it was nothing, possibly just influenza.
What happened? Aries inched closer, coming to stand beside Valen, where he still lounged in the armchair.
We were attacked by demons, and I dealt with them. But afterwards, I was checking a wound she picked up, and her blood smelled demon. I had the sense she was a demon.
He left out a few details there, too, like the fact he had been kissing her when that sense of her being a demon had struck him.
Is it possible demon blood got on her?
Aries' deep brown eyes held his. Marek shook his head.
No, I encased her in a wall. She was hit by a demon's claws, and then I made sure she was protected.
So your girlfriend is turning demon. Valen's eyebrows pinned high on his forehead.
Bummer. She is not my girlfriend,
Marek snapped, ignoring the part of himself that pointed out he had been hoping she would be that and so much more to him. He really didn't need his brothers knowing that.
How did you take it?
Diamond's eyes narrowed on him as they paled, turning almost white. A warning that his brother was probably mulling over how he might have taken it if he had been in Marek's shoes, and was either enjoying it or not liking it at all. Marek didn't dare ask which it was.
Badly.
He huffed and shoved his fingers through his hair.
I took it badly. Instinct kicked in.
Aries tipped his head up, his eyebrows rising as he said,
Ah.
Valen grimaced.
But if she's a demon, what does it matter?
Callistos shrugged as everyone looked at him.
Demon. We kill demons. You all forget that?
And what if she isn't really a demon? Diamond countered. I hate them as much as the next guy, but if she was mortal. Callistos' face darkened, his eyes turning stormy.
Wouldn't have stopped me.
Valen kicked him in the knee.
You get a woman of your own and say that if it happens to her. Thinking about that happening to Eva. Fuck. I don't want to think about it.
He dropped his feet to the floor, leaned forwards, and buried his head in his hands, his violet hair falling to cover them.
She definitely didn't give you the heebie-jeebies before.
Aries started pacing, his eyes not straying from Marek. Marek shook his head.
It isn't just what I felt, it's what she said. She was sick, Aries. She was afraid of me touching her, and I thought it was because she didn't want to make me sick. And she grew distant.
He rubbed his forehead and started pacing too, needing to work off some energy as he thought about everything, and about what he had done.
I attacked her.
Saying that out loud made him sick to his stomach, as if admitting it suddenly made it real when he had lived it, had stood there with his hand around her throat trying to choke the life out of her. It hit him hard and he swallowed, covered his mouth with his hand, and cursed.
When I realized what I was doing, I let her go. But I hurt her, and what she said, I don't think she was always a demon.
You believe that? Callistos tossed him a thunderous glare. She's a demon. They're all liars and bastards.
No, she's not a demon. She's becoming one. There is a damned difference.
He stalked towards his youngest brother, the ground shaking beneath his feet with each hard step, and Callistos leaned back, attempting to distance himself as Marek bore down on him.
She told me she wanted to tell me. She said she didn't want it, and she didn't have a choice.
He stilled and his shoulders sagged as the words she had hurled at him before disappearing hit him all over again. He whispered,
She said she wanted the damned blood out of her own.
Karis's green gaze drilled into him.
Out of her own.
Marek nodded.
Those were her exact words.
It wasn't as if he could forget them, or the fact she had disappeared from his life right after hurling them at him.
And then what happened?
Aries again. Marek closed his eyes.
I think she teleported.
Teleported? Diamond barked. Marek braced himself, waiting for one of them to point out that she was definitely a demon then, and definitely powerful, because the ability to teleport was rare in her kind and only manifested in older demons, which meant she had definitely been lying to him the whole time.
Amori could teleport,
Aries put in. The words carefully weighed and softly spoken, and Marek dared to look at him, because he hadn't even thought about that. Amori had been the first of their enemy they had encountered, a demon with the ability to teleport and also the power to steal abilities from another. He had taken Ares' fire the night Ares had met Megan, but his ultimate goal had been to take Megan's power to heal, so he could act as the medic for the enemy.
So your girlfriend isn't a fully fledged demon, but she is working for the enemy? Is that what I'm getting here?
Valen lifted his head and twisted on the armchair to look over the back of it. Marek wanted to point out again that she wasn't his girlfriend, but it would get him nowhere, and he was getting tired of his brothers thinking Katerina was the enemy, when from where he was standing it looked as if she was the victim in all of this.
She wanted the blood out of her. She said she had no choice, and she wanted to tell me.
He swallowed, hard.
I think this is my fault. The demons attacked the gate here, which means their focus is on me. I got her pulled into this.
And gods, he had thought he couldn't feel any worse than he already did, but there it was. Rock bottom.
Marek.
Karis started, and Marek shook his head because he didn't want coddling or excuses.
They must have seen her with me. I put a target on her back.
He turned on Karis, and his throat closed as reality hit him hard.
Now she's been infected with demon blood, and it's all my fault. And I attacked her because of it.
He sank to his backside on the arm of the couch next to Callistos, rested his elbows on his knees, and hung his head.
You're such a dick.
Valen was as helpful as always.
I probably would have flipped my shit too.
That wasn't any comfort. Valen flipped out around once a week, and often about something trivial.
What are you going to do?
Karis this time, and his deep voice held a note of what sounded a lot like concern to Marek. He lifted his head and met Karis's gaze as he replayed his last moments with Katerina, as he saw all over again how terrified she had been, and it hadn't been fear of him that had gripped her. She was scared of what was happening to her, but she didn't have to deal with it alone.
I'm going to find her.
Chapter 16 Finding Katerina had sounded easier than it turned out to be. Marek had visited the beach, the vampires' nests, and had even patrolled the entire Gothic quarter of Barcelona for 2 nights straight. So far, there had been no sign of her. He paused for a rest on one of the benches beneath the trees that lined one side of the wide-open paved area in front of the cathedral, and tracked the people with his gaze, studying each of them in turn. Had she gone into hiding? Or was she too sick now to move? Marek shoved that question aside before he could contemplate it, because he couldn't bear the thought of her getting worse when he had seen she was getting better. He knew nothing about this sort of thing, and he felt it as he sat watching the couples moving around the square. Even if he could find Katerina, he had no way of saving her. His entire plan revolved around apologizing and then asking her about what had happened to her, and the more he thought about it, the colder it sounded. She was infected, and he wanted to interrogate her about who had done it and what it was they wanted her to do, because he doubted they had done this to her just to get to him and weaken him. He singled out a couple, a dark-haired man dressed in a black t-shirt and worn blue jeans, with a woman wearing navy jeans and a cream spaghetti-strap camisole. The woman's caramel hair drew his focus to her, and he ached inside as he pictured it being Katerina, saw her turn and look at him with that warm smile she had bestowed on him once or twice, a smile that had heated him right down to his marrow. Gods, he missed her. The woman turned towards the dark-haired man, lifting her face towards him. He had to miss her more than he had thought, because now he was seeing Katerina in that woman, in that soft smile she offered to the man as she took his arm. Marek frowned as he slowly rose to his feet and took a closer look at the woman. It was Katerina. Darkness poured through him as his focus shifted to the slim man beside her, the one she was looking at with light in her hazel eyes as she talked to him. Who was he? The darkness coiled around his heart, twisting tightly to squeeze it as he began following them, and it hissed into his ear, whispering words about betrayal, about how another woman he had been foolish enough to feel something for had acted just like Katerina, fawning over another man. He clenched his teeth to deny the growl that wanted to roll up his throat and fought back against his darker nature, against the side of him that wanted to rip the man apart for just touching what was his. Katerina wasn't his. He kept telling himself that as he stalked them through the warren of narrow pedestrian streets and watched them walk into a bar, passing the patrons milling around outside it at small tables. He stopped outside on the pavement, stared in through the glass to Katerina as she took the seat the man offered, as she smiled and touched his hand. A black snarl peeled from his lips. The humans outside the bar scattered. Marek was storming into the building before he was even aware of what he was doing, shoving people aside as they dared to get in his way, and coming close to baring his emerging fangs at more than one of them.
Katerina,
he growled as he reached her. She stood sharply and swung to face him, her hazel eyes enormous.
Marek!
Her heartbeat was off the scale, thundering in his ears as the scent of her fear hit him.
Didn't expect to be caught.
He stepped up to her and she tossed a panicked glance at the man, confirming his worst fears. She had betrayed him with this man. She felt something for him. Did she feel nothing for Marek now? Had he killed it all that night on the beach? He wanted to turn away and leave, but he bottled that weak side up and clung to his fury, the jealous side of his blood that demanded retribution. He could feel like hell later, when this was all over, could lament what he had done and how badly things had gone, and nurse the fractured heart that pounded against his ribs as he glared at Katerina. As she stood her ground and faced him, her eyes hard and daring him to attack her again.
"What's going on?"
she said, far softer than he expected, and the rigid line of her shoulders relaxed.
That's my line. Who is he?
Marek jerked his chin towards the man. He hadn't bothered to stand, was still seated at the table with his dull eyes fixed on Marek, a watchful and wary edge to them.
"I can explain."
Katerina's voice shook as she edged towards the man, away from Marek.
I don't need an explanation, he barked and took a step back. I think I've seen enough.
"It isn't like that."
Her eyes grew wild and she leaned towards him, went to lift her hand and let it fall rather than reaching for him.
"You're overreacting."
Marek didn't think he was, and worse, he couldn't blame her for moving on, finding a man who wouldn't treat her as terribly as he had. His gaze flickered to her neck, to the fading bruises on it. He had never been one to burn bridges, but he wanted to torch the fragile remains of the one between him and Katerina, partly to protect her from his instincts that even now labeled her as a demon, partly because she really did deserve better. He held his tongue, though, because he was meant to be helping her and getting answers from her. If she had been infected by his enemy, then it was his fault. The least he could do was find a way to fix it for her, to free her of the grip of his enemy and the demonic blood running in her veins, even if she didn't end up with him.
Katerina.
He dared a step towards her. She glanced at the man on her left, a fearful look that had Marek's focus leaping to him. Was she afraid of this man? As his senses locked onto him, something hit him like a freight train. Darkness surged through him.
Vampire,
he sneered, unable to believe it even as everything clicked into place.
Did he do this to you? Is he with them?
A hellspawn might be a member of the ranks of his enemy, and he was looking right at one. And Katerina's silence said she had known what he was. Marek lunged for the bastard. Katerina stepped in his path, blocking his way to the vampire as she stretched her arms out. He slammed to a halt and stared at her, blinked as he struggled to take in what she had done. She was protecting him. She was protecting the vampire, and there was love and fear in her eyes as she did it.
You were conspiring against me all this time,
Marek snarled, his blood thundering in his ears and his fists shaking as he clenched them, as he looked between her and the vampire, waiting for her to deny it. The words that left her lips softly whispered weren't a denial, but they did send him reeling.
He's my brother.
Marek could only stare at the man as he placed his hands on Katerina's slender shoulders over the straps of her cream camisole. She tensed.
You don't have to protect me.
The man lowered his head towards her ear but didn't take his eyes off Marek.
I can handle this.
She threw a frantic look at him.
No, Guillaume, not this. This is mine to handle.
She lifted her left hand and placed it over his on her shoulder as she smiled, a gentle one that did nothing to soothe Guillaume's evident hunger to fight.
I'll be just a minute. Will you wait here?
Guillaume didn't look inclined to agree to that, but then he reluctantly released her and sat back down at the table and glared at Marek. In a fight, Marek would destroy him. He was weak, looked as if he hadn't fed in months. Was he the reason Katerina fought vampires? The reason she had asked Marek about a possible cure? Katerina scowled at Marek as she stormed past him, her shoulders tensing up again with each step, and he could sense the fury building inside her, the rage that would explode from her as soon as they were alone. He had his own dose of rage to level at her. She turned on him the moment he stepped out into the stifling evening heat. The fire that had been building in her was quick to die, and resignation flooded her hazel eyes as she took a lunging step towards him.
Please don't kill Guillaume.
Her fine eyebrows furrowed and she gently shook her head as tears filled her eyes.
What happened to him wasn't his fault, and he's never bitten anyone, I swear. You told me you were meant to hunt demons, and I'm one of those things, right? So take me, but just let Guillaume live.
Marek stared at her, stunned as he listened to her, as he saw the desperation in her eyes and sorrow too. That same emotion filled him, born of two things. She would sacrifice herself for her brother. She honestly believed Marek had come here to kill her. He wasn't sure what to say to that. He knew what half of his brothers would say. She was right, and she was a demon, or at least becoming one, and his duty was to hunt and kill their kind. But just as she clung to some crazy hope that she could turn her brother human again, he clung to a crazy hope that he was wrong about her, and she had told him the truth on the beach. She hadn't chosen this, and she wanted to be human again. He clung to the hope that he could find a way to make that happen.
I didn't come here to kill you, Katerina.
Something like relief crossed her eyes.
What do you want, then? You made your feelings about me abundantly clear on the beach.
Her hazel eyes darted to a group of people coming towards them along the narrow street. Afraid they would hear things they shouldn't? He wasn't. In his experience, mortals tended to forget hearing things that sounded too far-fetched to be real, or too frightening.
I shouldn't have reacted like that.
He diligently kept his eyes off her neck and those healing bruises. She dragged his focus to them by touching them.
Well, you did, and I figured I would never see you again. But here you are. and I'm finding it difficult to believe you didn't come to take another shot at me."
"Katerina," he said in a low voice, hoping she would hear the warning in it. "I didn't come here to fight." But if she kept provoking him, the darkness he was fighting to hold at bay might slip free of his control. That darker side of him labeled her as a demon, something to eradicate. He kept telling himself that she wasn't. Not yet, anyway. He wasn't sure he could kill her even if she did become a fully fledged demon. She hadn't chosen this. It had been forced upon her.
"I hate this,"
she whispered, frustration lacing those words, mingling with the pain that shone in her eyes. Tears lined them, tearing at his heart, and she scrubbed them away, turning her profile to him.
"I hate what's happening to me. I hate what they want me to do. I hate that I was going to do it."
Her gaze drifted to meet his. She shook her head.
"I hate that we can't be together."
He clenched his fists, denying the urge to reach out and feather his fingers across her cheek. He hated it too. As he stared at her, he realized that neither of them knew what to do. She was only part demon, but it was still enough to have most people in the underworld after her head, and his father would kill him if he so much as touched her. Hades would probably kill him several times over if he knew that Marek's feelings for her hadn't changed in the slightest. His instincts might view her as a demon to be dealt with, but his heart only saw Katerina. His beautiful, courageous, and reckless Katerina.
"You need to go."
She stepped up to him and pressed her hands to his chest, shoved him backwards as her eyes turned wild and desperate again.
"If you aren't near me, you're safe."
Marek shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until you tell me everything. What happened, Katerina? How did this happen to you? Who did this? I need answers." Because he needed to help her. That need had been strong in him before, after she had teleported from the beach and he had cooled off a little, able to look at things objectively again. It had grown stronger during his meeting with his brothers. Now it burned inside him, a compulsion that demanded he obey it. He had dragged Katerina into this, and he could pull her free of it. He wasn't sure how, but he would find a way.
"Marek,"
she started. Thick fog rolled through his head, and she wobbled in his vision. He blinked and reared back, gritted his teeth, and grunted as heat spread outwards from his right shoulder, burning a path across his flesh that had him close to doubling over as his strength left him and the world grew dim. It hit him that he had just been stabbed in the back, literally. He stared at Katerina into her wide eyes, catching the shock in them as she looked beyond him.
"You never said you were going to hurt him."
Those words leaving her lips cleaved his heart in two, and unleashed cold fire that blazed through him, consuming all of the softer parts of him, the weak parts that had brought him to this place, that had made it possible for this to happen. He tried to keep his focus on Katerina as he snarled, as he fought the heaviness invading his mind and his body, weighing his limbs down. Her eyes shifted to him, fear shining in them, fear he refused to believe was real. None of this had been real. It had been a lie, a manipulation, and he had fallen for it, believing she felt something for him, that she had been pulled into this because of him, and that he could save her. He had been betrayed. Again. Fool him once, shame on the vampire bitch. Fool him twice, he was going to kill the fucking lot of them. Chapter 17. Cal wove through the late-night traffic on the Victoria Embankment, the street lamps dotted between the towering trees on either side of the four-lane road, flashing over the visor of his helmet. A visor that dampened his vision, but he was sick of Karis berating him about road safety. His older brother needed to get a life or a hobby other than making Cal's life hell. It was bad enough he was stuck with Karis as a partner, couldn't shake the bastard no matter how hard he tried. Karis was perpetually stuck in big bro mode when it came to him, so Cal was perpetually trapped in the lowest, worst level of the underworld. At least it felt that way. Worse were the times all his brothers treated him like a kid. He huffed and swerved left, slipping the motorbike between a double-decker bus and a shitty electric car that was so compact, he wasn't even sure how the driver fitted in it. He revved the engine as he pulled up beside it. The pretty brunette behind the wheel glanced at him, a frown marring her delicate features.
Cal flicked his visor up and grinned at her as he kept pace with her, slowing to a boring speed, one that had him sure he was going to fall off his damn bike. He revved the engine again, the purr of it sending a shiver of pleasure through him, together with the sweet vibration of it beneath him. The brunette cracked, her scowl becoming a smile as she slowed to a halt at a set of traffic lights. Cal stopped beside her and tapped on her window. She shifted her right hand from the steering wheel and the window whirred downwards. "Hey, beautiful." He leaned towards her, resting his left elbow on her door and planting his boot on the road to keep the bike from toppling over and making him look like a fool. "Want a ride?" He patted the sleek fuel tank wedged between his thighs, stroking the metallic lime green and black paint. "I can go fast or slow, whatever revs your engine." A blush scalded her cheeks.
I really shouldn't.
She cleared her throat, her blush deepening as her eyes dropped to his hand as he stroked it closer to his hips.
I have a boyfriend.
He shrugged. "Whatever. Not like I'm asking you to marry me. Just offering a ride to a pretty girl." Her eyes darted between his hand as he rested it on his inside thigh and his face, a war erupting in them. The traffic lights changed. The bus driver hit the horn like it was going out of fashion. She tensed and panicked, fumbled with her steering wheel.
I have to go.
For a moment, she looked as if she was going to crumble.
I have a boyfriend,
she blurted and put her foot on the gas, creeping forwards at her mundane speed. "Your loss." Cal slammed his visor down, gunned the engine on the sleek Kawasaki Ninja superbike, and peeled away, the front wheel lifting off the tarmac as he passed the woman, tearing down the narrow gap between the two lanes of traffic. There were plenty of other fish in London, and one of them was bound to take the bait tonight so he could blow off some steam. Patrols had gone quiet, gate activity hitting a boring zero in the last 2 nights, as if someone had flipped a switch. It was weird, but he wasn't going to sweat it. Demons would pop up soon enough, and he could blow off steam that way, too. He darted through the vehicles for fun, grinning whenever one of the humans tooted their weedy horns at him, cutting close to the more expensive sports cars to rile their owners. One of them even wound his window down to holler abuse at Cal. Cal flipped him off over his shoulder, applied a little pressure to the air inside the guy's tire, and laughed as it burst. He hit a stretch of empty road as he made it ahead of the traffic and slowed to a more reasonable 50 miles per hour, taking in the broad swath of the Thames as it glittered to his left, reflecting the lights from the London Eye and the buildings on the other side. Parliament loomed ahead on his side, signaling the end of his fun unless he did a U-turn and went back the other way. He was debating it as a weird sensation crawled over his back and head, the same sensation he had been having for a while now. It wasn't his ability to sense demons kicking in. This was something else. Cal pulled the bike over to the side of the road and cut the engine. He looked around him, trying to find the source of the feeling of being watched. It was starting to unsettle him now, because over the last week it had felt different. There was no malevolence in it, not like there had been before. His phone vibrated. He unzipped his black leather jacket, reached inside, and pulled it out. The light from the screen reflected off his visor, but he could read the message. A meeting in Tokyo. He stuffed the phone back into his jacket, zipped it up, and focused as he gripped his bike. Shadows wrapped around him and darkness surrounded him, and then light as he landed in the large garage he had added beneath his townhouse. He pulled his helmet off, set it down on the fuel tank, and kicked the stand down. He tugged the bike up onto it and eased off it, ran his hand over the leather seat, and cursed his brothers for ruining his night. He looked over his shoulder at the line of bikes parked along the wall at a diagonal, their jewel-colored paint gleaming under the bright strip lights in the white room. He had wanted to take each of them out for a spin. Maybe the meeting would be over with quickly and he could get back to riding. He didn't bother to remove his leather jacket before teleporting, landing on the porch of the old mansion. The wooden deck creaked beneath his weight as he removed his boots and kicked them into the corner, next to the rack where his brothers had neatly placed theirs. He shoved the door open. "Well, all we know is what Zeus said." Valen's voice rose above the din of voices coming from Cal's right as he stepped into the long room. "When Calendria died..." Cal didn't hear the rest as he was whipped back through time, to a dark bluff on a mountainside, to her screams and his desperate bellows as he tried to break free of his bonds and help her. He fell to his knees, clutched the sides of his head, and screamed with her. Hands grabbed him and he fought them, but they wouldn't relent. They were too strong, overpowering him, binding him as he thrashed against them, desperate to break free of them just as he had tried to break free of his bonds. He wrestled, lashed out with his legs and his elbows, managed to catch one of them with his head. Pain spiderwebbed across his skull and his vision dimmed, the muffled grunt that left his opponent's lips not bringing the satisfaction he had thought it would. He kept fighting them, the need to reach his sister hitting boiling point as her screams continued, as she pleaded the bastards to have mercy on her, on him, as she offered her life in exchange for his. He snarled through his tears, begged her not to do it, begged the bastards not to listen to her, to listen to him instead. His life for hers. She was precious. She deserved life. The world couldn't lose her. One captor remained, his grip so strong Cal couldn't shake it, no matter how many blows he landed or how fiercely he struggled. A hand clamped down over his forehead, the pressure of it pleasant as the riot in his head slowly dulled and darkness encroached, creeping in from the corners of his mind to steal everything away. He slipped into it, welcoming it as he became aware of what was coming, escaping the past before the inevitable moment when his entire world had changed. The darkness devoured him just as she started to scream. He drifted in it a while, made a wish to stay there forever. Light burst around Cal, bright and blinding, and he shot up, blinked as he looked around him and found he was sitting on the floor. Golden tatami mats. Tokyo. He swallowed and frowned, looked at the feet surrounding him, at the arms holding him from behind. His strength left him in a rush, and he sank against Karis's chest. I was on my bike. There was a pretty woman in a car. He growled and clenched his teeth as he tried to remember the rest of what had happened, but it wouldn't come. Karis stroked his forehead, that touch soothing the raging headache building in his temples, keeping the darkness at bay. You're fine, his brother murmured softly in his ear. I was chatting up a human. He clenched his fists and his face crumpled. She was pretty. I know, Valen said as he eased to crouch before him, his golden eyes warm and tender. And now you're here. Nothing vital happened. You don't know that, he snapped and pushed Karis away when his touch became stifling, twisting his insides and making him feel as if he couldn't breathe. What if I forgot something important? What if something triggered it and I forgot it? Karis gently placed a hand on his shoulder. You haven't. His brother hesitated, conflict reigning in his green eyes before he added, We were talking about her. Cal's eyes slowly widened and all of the fight rushed out of him. He sagged where he sat on the floor, his gaze falling to rest on it as the fear and frustration became sorrow that threatened to devour his heart. I see. He couldn't bring himself to look at his brothers, not now that he knew why he had blacked out. He didn't want to see the pity in their eyes, didn't want to see how weak they thought he was because of his affliction. It was bad enough that they constantly coddled him because of it, treading on eggshells around him, keeping things from him. Karis squeezed his shoulder. Cal jerked out of his grip and shoved to his feet. I'm fine. He paced away from his brothers towards the panels that had been slid open to reveal the elegant courtyard that filled the space between the three sides of the mansion. Bright sunlight warmed the pale gravel and birds flitted between the neatly clipped pine trees, dancing among the twisting branches to the perfect ovals of green needles at the end of each of them. The stepping stones that wound between them led his eye to the koi pond that separated the courtyard from the main garden, to the vermilion-arched wooden bridge that crossed the water to the other side, where mossy boulders and trees tangled together in perfect harmony. She would have loved this place. He wanted to remember her again. He wanted to remember what his brothers had been talking about before his episode, but he didn't dare risk it. It would only trigger another attack, and this time he might pass out. It had happened before, in the early days when he had tried to remember, foolishly believing that if he pushed himself, it would all come back to him, and he could help his sister by recalling what had happened, by remembering who had killed her. The last time he had tried that, he had been out cold for 5 days. He couldn't allow that to happen when the gates were in so much danger. This battle needed all of them on the front line if they were going to win it. He turned around and looked at his brothers, and realized one was missing. Where's Marek? Karis's expression grew grave. We don't know. We tried contacting him, but he isn't answering. He wasn't in Seville when I checked, Aries said and jammed his hands into the pockets of his black jeans. Diamond glanced at Escher as he began pacing, his bare feet carrying him swiftly across the mats. Cal hoped like hell nothing had happened to Marek, because if it had, Escher wouldn't be the only one going nuclear. He would be right there with him. Chapter 18. Marek's back hurt like a bitch. He shuffled to the wall of the dark, empty room, struggling to crab crawl with his hands bound, keeping his bare backside off the oak floor. His heightened vision revealed the space to him, one ability the demons hadn't taken from him. Maybe they couldn't. They had shut down his power over the earth and his ability to teleport, and his telekinesis wasn't working either. When he reached the wall, he rubbed his back against the pale green plaster, a desperate attempt to make the burning stop. A grimace tugged at his lips as he twisted his hands behind him and maneuvered into a better position, one where he could itch the point on his left shoulder. The floor was cold beneath him, the air in the room frigid despite the fact it was high summer, and he chuckled as a thought pinged into his head. This was probably Diamond's version of paradise. The air conditioning unit whirring above the door had to be industrial meat locker grade. The demons were intent on keeping him docile, using the cold to steal more of his strength and make him sluggish. Dehydration and the cold would take care of that. His muscles were stiff already, his joints hard to move. The relief that hit him when he managed to find the itchy spot on his shoulder was sweet and almost drugging, and he fell into an easy rhythm, rubbing against the wall until heat bloomed and trickled down his back. The smell of his own blood was strong in the air, together with other things that Marek was not about to admit came from him. He wasn't sure how long he had been out before coming around to find himself naked in what had turned out to be his prison cell, but he had been awake for more than a day now. Not that he could really tell. Someone had nailed boards over the tall windows, blocking out the sunlight. "Fucking demons," he spat, and kept rubbing, drawing more blood, working up more heat. Whatever the bastard had carved on his back, it had done a number on Marek's powers. A ward? He had no doubt now that the Wraith was behind his capture, and what had happened to Katerina, if he could believe her anymore. He wanted to, but it was hard as he shed more blood, leaving the wall behind him red with it as he waited for the demon to decide to fuck around with him again. The illusionist had brought Katerina into this room and made her stand there watching him for almost an hour. The dark violet-haired demon had been forced to hold her arm the entire time to keep her upright. Whatever was happening to Katerina, it was getting worse again. She had looked better when he had found her in Barcelona, but the last time she had been brought to him as some weird form of torment, or perhaps a test to see if he would react to her either violently or sexually, her skin had been as white as snow and she had been shaking and sweating profusely. And Marek had foolishly wanted to tell the demon bitch to undo whatever the fuck it was they had done to her, because they had him now. He growled at himself and stoked the anger, the darker side of him that was more than happy to point out what a gigantic idiot he had been to trust a woman again, especially after what had happened with Valen. Eva had been hired by their enemy to seduce him and lure him over to their side. They had tried the same crap on Marek and he had fallen for it, although he doubted they wanted him to fight on their team. They had grander plans for him, ones he wasn't going to stick around to find out about. He kept rubbing until his shoulder was raw and burned from it rather than the symbol they had carved on him. It had to be a ward. The Wraith had taken Escher's memories through a fragment of his soul he had stolen with his blade, the same blade he had used on Marek to knock him out, which meant he also had some of Marek's memories now. And he knew a whole host of wards that could easily be implemented even by a demon. He thanked the gods that when they had created new wards around the Tokyo mansion, that they had chosen to do it all away from each other, and that he only knew the ward he had made. Breaking one ward wouldn't allow the enemy to penetrate the barrier around the mansion, which meant it was still a safe place for his brothers and their women. Marek leaned to his right and tried to peer over his shoulder at the ward carved into his flesh. All he could see was blood. He couldn't tell whether he had managed to make it deep enough yet to disrupt the power of the ward. His healing ability wasn't helping him. Whenever he thought he was making progress, that ability kicked in, undoing his work. The demons could have been kind enough to lock that one down too. He looked around the room again, a futile endeavor since it was empty and he had checked every crevice of it for something he could use to either pry open his bonds or carve a damned hole in the ward. The green walls were growing more red by the hour, and patches of dried blood now decorated the wooden floor, dark against the polished oak. But he was getting nowhere. The only way to get rid of this ward and get his powers back was to destroy it, and that meant getting his hands free and on a blade or something sharp. The door opened, throwing light across him, and the illusionist slinked into the room, her long black dress flowing around her feet to conceal them. She halted in front of him, but he kept his eyes on the open door, on the freedom it taunted him with, a glimpse of a cream corridor and a side table that had an elegant crystal vase on it.
It will not work.
Her honey-sweet voice dripped in his ears as she leaned towards him, dragging his focus to her. Her breasts threatened to spill from the low V of her dress. He curled a lip at her. She sighed and looked to her right when he glanced there at the door.
No escape that way.
She eased down in front of him, her silver eyes swirling as her black lips curled into a faint, satisfied smile.
How infuriating it must be to have your powers bound.
She pouted, pulling a face of mock pity that tore a growl from him, because it hit him that this was payback. He and his brothers had put her in Escher's cage when they had caught her. The enchantments on it stole the powers of those contained within it, rendering them weak. Escher used it when the full moon hit a lunar perigee, the point in the year when it was closest to the Earth. Diamond had to lock him in the cage because what he became was dangerous. A beast more savage than anyone could imagine, thirsty for violence and controlled by a need to shed human blood and watch them suffer. The cage kept Escher and the world safe from that savage, dangerous side of him. This demon had been given a taste of the cage, and now she wanted him to experience what she had. Or perhaps it was the wraith who wanted him to suffer as she had. A gift to her that evidently pleased her as she observed Marek, and he couldn't hide how much this was annoying him, how much he despised being without his powers, left at the mercy of his enemy.
The female did well to bring you to us.
The woman canted her head, causing her glossy, straight, dark violet hair to fall away from her shoulder.
We should reward her. Perhaps we should complete our end of the bargain and take care of her brother's problem.
Katerina had been telling the truth about the vampire being her brother then, and about her reason for doing what she had done to Marek. It didn't make him feel any better. It only made him feel worse, because it confirmed that she had betrayed him. She had chosen to save her brother by condemning him. He bared his short fangs at the demon as they emerged, as he felt the darkness pouring into his veins, turning his eyes black. The illusionist's eyes narrowed as her smile widened.
A reaction at last.
She leaned closer.
He will be pleased. It seems the little female got to you just as he suspected. He was right to bring her into the fold. We had thought you would be the difficult one. It was disappointingly easy to capture you.
Marek spat in her face. She flinched, her face twisting in disgust as she brought her hand up and delicately wiped the spit away. She looked at her hand, struck him hard across his right cheek with it and sent him falling onto his side. His head spun, vision twirling, and he rolled his eyes, trying to shake off the blow before she got any ideas about following up with another one.
Weak creature!
She snarled and pushed to her feet to tower over him. Her silver eyes glowed as she glared down at him.
We will break you. By the time we are done with you, you will be the one on your knees telling us everything we want to know.
She swept from the room, slammed the door, and he closed his eyes as the sound of metal scraping against metal filled his ears. He listened to her as she stormed away from him, and it stoked the fire inside him, refusing to give in as she wanted. She wouldn't break him. He was going to get free of this place and this damned ward, and then he was going to destroy them. His vision wavered out of focus, but first he was just going to rest his eyes. When he opened them again, he was on his back, his hands numb beneath him. He groaned and rolled onto his side, onto his front, and shoved his face against the floorboards to push himself up. He shuffled his knees beneath him and grimaced as he sat up. Every muscle on his torso protested and cramped in response, but he managed it. His stomach growled. His parched throat screamed for water. Marek looked at the boarded windows. How long had he been out? He tried to look at his shoulder, but he could only see the start of the mark carved on it. It was fully healed again. "Damn it!" he barked and wriggled backwards towards the wall. The cold fire that had burned inside him since the night he had been taken blazed colder still, as he remembered everything the demon had said about Katerina, and his darker side latched onto it. She had betrayed him. She was going to pay for that. No one betrayed him and got away with it. The need for retribution mingled and entwined with the darkness, and he gave in to it as he started rubbing against the wall, harder this time, the hunger for vengeance a driving force within him, filling his head with pleasing images. He would start with Katerina, knew she was in this building somewhere. He would get rid of this ward, break free of his bonds, and he would find her. Once she had paid for what she had done to him, he would regain his strength and bring hell down on this house and its occupants. The thought that he had been weak again taunted him, giving the darkness a stronger grip on him. He sank into it, relished it as it gave him strength, a purpose. He wouldn't be weak again. He had let her pass the barriers again when he should have kept them slammed shut against her. He shouldn't have tried to find her. He shouldn't have cared that she might be turning into a demon. He should have called it quits long before he had realized her brother was a vampire. He shouldn't have let his ridiculous feelings for her blind him. She was a demon, maybe not in body, not yet, but she had proven herself just as vicious and vile as their kind, willing to lure someone to their death. The darkness inside him writhed, hungry to be fed, for the carnage his mind was swift to imagine as he kept scrubbing his shoulder against the wall. Rapid footsteps sounded on the other side of the wall to his left, followed by something hitting it hard. He stilled right down to his breathing and reached for his powers. A curse peeled from his lips when they didn't come, and he listened to the heartbeat rushing in his ears. Not his own. It belonged to whoever was on the other side of the wall. Metal scuffed, the doorknob jiggled, and another attempt was made, the sound of the metal scraping against each other grating in his ears. A burst of light. He flinched away from it and glared at the silhouetted figure in the doorway. The petite shadow blurred as it moved, refusing to come into focus as adrenaline pushed his already fatigued body right to its limit. Was it the illusionist come to break him? He feared he might do just that as she entered the room, coming towards him. He frowned and amended that, stumbling towards him. That frown deepened when his damned vision finally cleared and he could make out the woman who hit the floor just a few feet from him, collapsing in a heap. Katerina. She recovered swiftly, throwing a panicked look over her shoulder. "Drop the act," he growled, not wanting to play this game anymore. He looked at the doorway. "Come out. I know you're just trying to fuck with me. I know you're there." No one appeared in the doorway. It was a struggle to get his senses functioning properly, but when he managed it, he found only two signatures in the immediate vicinity. Katerina and him.
"Have to be quick."
Katerina's voice was low, hoarse, and weak. She crawled towards him. "Get away from me." He reared back, kicked at her with his left leg, and caught her right arm. She went down hard, even though he had barely touched her, face planting on the floor. She lay there a moment, her breaths uneven, fast in his ears. Finally she moved, pressing her palms to the oak boards and wobbling as she pushed herself up.
"Trying to help."
She pushed each word out with an evident struggle as she wavered on her hands and knees.
"Don't have long. They don't leave for long."
Who doesn't leave for long? Marek told himself not to fall for this. It was another ploy, a lie constructed to weaken him again, to make him trust the demon crawling towards him. He would never trust her again.
"The demons,"
she whispered and whimpered as she stopped, as she hung her head and clutched her stomach, banding one arm around it. His stupid heart jerked in his chest, panic flooding him as he waited to see if she was going to pass out. She was sick. Her hair was damp, hanging in tendrils around her face as she lifted it, revealing a sweat-dotted brow and dull eyes.
"Be quick."
He wasn't sure she was talking to him now as she inched forwards. She muttered things beneath her breath, Catalan words that sounded a lot like a prayer. Her breath sawed from her lips, each one cutting him despite how fiercely he tried to remain immune to her. When she finally reached him, she gritted her teeth and eased up on her knees. He tensed when she reached behind her and pulled a knife from the waist of her navy jeans. It fell from her fingers as she cried out and doubled over, clutching herself again. Another prayer fell from her lips. Marek stared at the knife on the floor.
"You here to kill me?"
He kept still, conserving his strength in case he needed it. He was in no state to fight, not with his strength and powers bound, and his hands tied behind his back. But Katerina wasn't in any state to fight either. He could almost feel her weakness as she held herself, as hoarse sobs burst from her lips and she shuddered. When whatever terrible pain that racked her had passed, she inched her hand towards the blade, using her fingers to drag it towards the hilt. They shook as she pulled it towards her, and her grip was limp as she finally closed her hand around it.
Turn.
She breathed hard, struggled into an upright position again, and looked at his waist.
"So you can stab me in the back again?"
Tears glistened on her cheeks as her brow furrowed.
Trying to free you. Maybe pick lock.
Is that what she had done with the door? She hadn't been picking the lock then. No, she must have used the knife and her limited strength to break it open, draining herself in the process.
"Forget the bonds."
He hoped he wasn't going to regret this. It wasn't trusting her again. He kept telling himself that as he shuffled so his back was to her, trying to make it easier on her. He was using her this time. Not just to get free, either. She had been a guest in this house and would be able to give him information on it, and on her hosts. Or should he say her allies?
"See that mark on my back? Slice through it."
What?
He found it hard to believe that horror in her voice was genuine.
"You already stabbed me in the back once. Just do it again."
He didn't miss the way she glared at him, and he didn't repent either. She deserved everything she got from him as far as he was concerned. Her throat worked on a hard swallow as she stared at his back. She was going to bottle out.
"Do it. Do it or I'll hunt your fucking brother down and slaughter him,"
he snarled, his voice darker than he had ever heard it. She gasped. He let it bounce off his back because he was done being nice to her. She had burned that bridge between them before he could get there and do it for her.
I'll help,
she murmured weakly.
Don't hurt Guillaume.
I bet that's what you said to them, too.
He couldn't keep the venom from his voice as the cold fire in his heart turned white-hot with an emotion he didn't want to contemplate. He wasn't jealous of the lengths she would go to for her brother, revealing how deeply she loved the vermin. He wasn't. He grunted when she suddenly stabbed him in the back, hard enough to jerk him forwards, and gritted his teeth as she drew the blade down, slicing right through the heart of the mark carved on his shoulder.
You deserve that,
she spat, and then something thudded on the floor. The knife? He looked over his shoulder as heat spread through him, bringing strength in its wake, and the power of the ward dissipated. Katerina lay on her side, out cold, her damp caramel hair spilling across the floorboards and the hilt of the knife balanced on her open palm. He felt nothing as he looked at her. He closed his eyes and turned away. He felt nothing. His heart called him a liar. Marek waited for more of his strength to return, and then focused it all on his arms, on his wrists as he pulled them apart. The chain linking his bonds snapped, the sudden release of his arms flinging him forwards. He slammed a hand into the floor to stop himself from hitting it and slowly looked back at Katerina. He felt nothing. Telling himself that didn't do shit as he moved onto his knees and went to her. As he canted his head and looked down at her, studying every dark hollow on her pale face. Even out cold, she was breathing too rapidly and shaking. Had the demons done something else to her? He gathered her into his arms and stumbled onto his feet, and paused as he looked at the door. She had said the demons didn't stay away for long. If he waited, he could deal with them now. He looked down at Katerina. She was burning up, her trembling growing worse as he held her tucked against his bare chest. He wasn't sure there was anything he could do to help her, but gods, he wanted to try. Setting himself up for another fall? Probably, but he just couldn't convince himself to hate her, to hold her responsible for what had happened to him. He couldn't bring himself to believe that she had known what would happen that night in Barcelona when he had found her with her brother.
Idiot,
he muttered to himself, a name he more than deserved, and one that was far nicer than the ones his brothers were going to use when they discovered what he had done. He reasoned that he was in no fit state to battle two strong demons on their own turf, and that the best warrior armed himself with knowledge first, and then steel. Katerina was a vital weapon in this war, one he intended to use to its fullest. She would tell him everything, and if she refused, he would let his brothers handle her. He turned away and stepped with her, reappearing in a dark wood-clad vestibule. He leaned back as his strength wavered, the gray stone arch that surrounded one of the leaded windows cool against his burning shoulder. He needed to get Katerina to the basement, but teleporting again would be a mistake. He couldn't afford to pass out, not before he had her contained anyway. Marek slowly crossed the vestibule of the castle, his body warming as the heat of day met it, and he passed the shafts of sunlight that washed into the room, from the row of arched windows to his left. He passed a corridor and kept going, took a right near a shadowy section of the hallway and headed that way, towards stone steps that led downwards. He carefully picked his way down the spiral staircase, doing his best not to damage Katerina as she slumbered in his arms. The light and heat of day gave way to chilling darkness, an echo of where he had spent the last gods knew how many days. He tried not to let it affect him as he banked right against the bottom of the steps. The cold flagstones chilled the bare soles of his feet as he carried Katerina to the first cell in a row of 3, opened the solid iron door and took her inside. He set her down on the cot that had seen better days and hesitated as he looked down at her. When his brothers learned what she had done, they would want to hurt her. Could he let them do that, when he honestly couldn't say whether she had betrayed him or not? It felt like a betrayal, but he was jaded, his view colored by his past. The darkness he had managed to push back and contain rose within him again as he looked at her, as his shoulder burned and the shackles around his wrists weighed them down. It condensed into a malevolent force, a hunger that wouldn't be denied. Marek turned away from Katerina, exited the cell, and closed the door. He slid the bolts across, sealing her in the dark room, and peered through the small window of bars at her where she lay on her back, every inch of her shaking. She was safer in there, away from him, at least until he was back in control of himself. Although regaining that control was going to take her telling him everything. Only then would he be able to even begin believing her. He trudged away from her, his feet heavy as the darker part of him grew restless, filling him with a need to turn back and watch over her. Not because he didn't trust her this time. She was sick, weak, and he feared she wouldn't last the day. He moved up through the castle, forcing himself to place some distance between them, as he fought to untangle what he really wanted. The darkness within him wanted to hurt her, but it also wanted to take away her pain. It wanted her to suffer and wanted to protect her. He laughed mirthlessly as he shoved his hands through his hair. What was wrong with him? He gripped the rail of the thick mahogany banister on the main staircase and followed it up to the first floor, where he and his brothers had their rooms. His gaze strayed to the arched windows that lined the gray stone wall to his left as he passed along the corridor. Sunlight rippled across the lock, lapping against the rocks that formed the shoreline around the castle. Beyond the deep water that surrounded the island, mountains rose, golden and pale green, laced with patches of pink where the heathers bloomed. How long had it been since he had visited this place? He and his brothers kept it as a safe house now, a place only they knew about and one they could escape to if everything went wrong and they lost their stronghold in Tokyo. Sometimes Marek came here to enjoy the solitude. He pushed the wooden door to his room open and headed for the bathroom, stopping in front of the cream marble sink. He turned the tap on and waited. A few minutes passed before the system kicked in. Air hissed and gurgled from the tap, and then water, a trickle at first. He ran his hand under it and shuddered at the icy coldness of it. He would need to fire up the boiler if he wanted it warm. A shower was out of the question until then. He was lucky the electricity hadn't gone out like it had the last time he had visited. It had taken him a day to fix the wiring once he had found where the local creatures had chewed through it. They had eaten their way through half the contents of the larder, too. Marek filled the basin and splashed the water on his face. He hissed as he washed his shoulder, the cold water stinging the cut. He was going to need Karis to remove the ward for him, before the wound healed and it kicked back to life. Karras was not going to be happy. His focus drifted to Katerina as he washed himself off, shuddering whenever the cold became too much. How was he going to keep his brothers from killing her once they discovered what had happened? He had been missing for days. By now, they would be frantic, and he didn't want to think about how Escher was handling it. He needed to get word to his brothers and ask them to meet him, Escher excluded. He couldn't risk his brother coming to the island and realizing that he had Katerina locked in the basement. He might be able to talk reason into the others, convincing them that she was a valuable source of information, but was too weak for any rough interrogation tactics they might have in mind. Talking reason into Escher wasn't going to be an option. His brother would kill her on sight. He tensed when noise sounded below him, grabbed a pair of dark gray sweats from the dresser in his bedroom and pulled them on. He moved stealthily from the room, easing along the corridor, straining to hear who it was. The demons? The Wraith could use portals, but there was no way he could have tracked Marek to this location, or entered the building without triggering the wards.
"You here, old man?"
Ares' voice boomed up the stairs, tugging a smile from Marek.
"That's my nickname for you."
Marek looked over the banister at the top of the stairs. Ares tilted his head back, and relief filled his dark eyes.
"Thought it might get a response."
All the light and warmth left his older brother's eyes.
"Where the fuck have you been?"
"Are you alone?" Marek knew an opportunity when he saw it. Out of all of his brothers, and regardless of what many people who knew them thought, Ares was the most liable to keep his head in any given situation. Even one like this. Ares nodded.
"So you want to explain yourself before the rest arrive? I'm getting the feeling you weren't off on vacation with your girlfriend."
Marek didn't even bother to correct him because it was going to become blindingly apparent Katerina was anything but his girlfriend when he explained what had happened to him. He made his way down the stairs to the turn that brought him face to face with Ares where he hadn't moved off the bottom step. He sank to his backside on the landing there and sighed. Where to begin?
"I found Katerina in Barcelona. We had a little confrontation. She thought I was going to kill her brother." "Why? He a demon too?"
Ares frowned and gold sparks lit his eyes, an indicator that his mood was heading south. Marek cringed inside. He shouldn't have brought the brother up, but he knew Katerina would when she came around, and his brothers all spoke to her, so there was little point in trying to pretend he didn't exist, or that he wasn't a vampire. Ares didn't know about Marek's habit of hunting vampires, so the fact her brother was one wouldn't matter in his brother's eyes, although there was a chance he might draw the same rash conclusion that Marek had and believe he was the hellspawn involved with their enemy. Marek didn't get a chance to see what Ares would say. Karras appeared beyond him, swiftly followed by Callistos.
"Shit, it's been a while since I came to this gloomy place."
Valen's voice echoed along the corridor from the vestibule. Diamond's deep voice joined him.
"Never did like it here either, except in winter. It's nice in winter."
"You would think that." The third male voice made Marek freeze up faster than a touch from Diamond. Escher. Marek launched from the stairs, his first mistake. Escher took one look at him, at the lines of the mark that reached the top of his left shoulder, and his eyes blackened, narrowed as he drew down a deep breath and snarled.
"Where's the fucking demon I can smell?"